Welcome to Dr. Creepin's Dungeon. Dead people's diaries can be terrifying because they offer a haunting glimpse into the thoughts and experiences of someone who is no longer alive, creating an unsettling connection between the reader and the deceased. The entries may reveal eerie premonitions, unresolved fears, or disturbing secrets that hint at a tragic or violent end. As you read their words, the sense of intrusion grows. Each line serves as a chilling reminder that their story was cut short, leaving unanswered questions and the uneasy feeling that something, or someone, might still be lurking in the shadows. As we shall see in tonight's feature-length story. Now, as ever before we begin, a word of caution. Tonight's tale may contain strong language as well as descriptions of violence and horrific imagery. If that sounds like your kind of thing, then let's begin.
Part 1. Past Words. I tiptoed slowly through the dark hallways of the ancient hospice care. I'd only been awake for a few minutes, and my eyes felt heavy with sleep. At first I couldn't quite put my finger on what exactly had interrupted my slumber. It had been a sound, I knew that much, but it was too distant and muffled to properly comprehend. My first instinct had been to wake up my mother, but her bed had been emptied, messy and cold. She'd clearly been gone for a while. Still, her instructions had been clear. Stay in the room at night, and don't go looking for trouble. But to a 7-year-old child without their mother for comfort, every howl of the wind and creak of old wood turns malicious. I knew I'd get in trouble if I left our room, but my fear of being alone far outweighed the orders I'd been given. As I left the room, I could have sworn I heard the faint sounds of a man crying in the distance. He sounded like he needed help. I decided to visit the nursing station on the ward, hoping my mother would be there and that someone could assist the crying man. It wasn't far to walk, but in the darkness I could hardly see 2 feet in front of me. The lights had been turned off for the night, giving the patient some much-needed rest. Since I didn't know where the main switch was situated, I had to rely on my own memory and walls for support. "Hello?" I called out as I approached the nursing station. It had been abandoned, with little more than a few books and a cold cup of tea left behind. "Mom?" No response. All that existed around me were the empty hallways, filled with little more than the sobs from a broken man. I should have been more afraid, but having spent the majority of my life around sick and dying people had given me a different perspective on what it meant to be human. Rather than fearing the strange sounds before me, I pitied whoever had created them. And if the nurses weren't around to help him, then I had to take action. There was an old rechargeable flashlight in one of the cupboards. It was frequently used during the main power outages at the hospice. I decided to snatch it to make my way easier, promising to put it back before anyone would notice. "Hello? Mister, are you okay?" I said in a half-whisper. I was afraid to wake up the other patients, but I still foolishly tried to reach out to him. It was hard to gauge where exactly the sound was coming from. It sounded muffled, and the way it echoed through the hallway disoriented me too much to accurately judge. The hospice had been poorly designed, with endlessly long hallways, dimly lit up through the small windows. It was a true labyrinth of darkness, one that was hard to navigate even during the day. Had it not been for the vast amount of time I'd spent there, I would have gotten lost immediately. "Where are you, mister?" I called out again. But in response to my soft calls, I received only more sobs. They were intermittently interrupted by the briefest of sentences. In a way, it sounded like the man was arguing with himself, shooting incoherent messages back and forth. "Hello?" I asked, daring to let it out a bit louder that time. Still no response, save the hopeless cries. I kept wandering the halls, trying to figure out where everyone had gone. The voice of the crying man just sounded further and further away. But behind the echo, I started to realize that the sound wasn't coming from the ward itself, but from down below. The man was in the basement. It was pretty much the only room left in the facility that I had yet to visit. Separated from the ward by a rusted metal door, it was strictly off limits to everyone save for the janitor. According to my mother, It housed little more than backup generators and some tools. Thus, it was deemed too dangerous for regular staff. But if a patient had gotten lost down there, maybe I could help him get out again. The heavy door creaked as I pushed it open. Behind it lay nothing more than pitch-black darkness. The cries that had once been muffled were finally freed from their echoing prison of 4-inch metal, and I knew I was heading in the right direction. "Hello," I called out again, and just like before, the voices only returned incoherent rambles. "I don't want to be here. Please, I'm not supposed to be here. I just want to go, please. Let me go," the voice said. With the broken begging, I finally recognized the voice. It was Mr. Henderson, a man who suffered from terminal cancer. He was one of the patients I'd spent the most time with, happily sitting at his bedside as he told me stories from his youth. But he had died a week prior, his body finally giving out to the spreading poison in his body. He couldn't possibly be the one trapped in the basement. At the young age, I still hadn't probably grasped the concept of death. Though I knew that every person ended their journey on Earth at some point, it felt like a foreign, distant idea. At the moment I stood in the staircase, staring into the dark abyss below, I felt happy to hear his voice again. "Mr. Henderson, did you get lost?" I called out as I walked down the narrow staircase. He just kept sobbing. "It hurts to be here. Let me go. No, I'm staying. This is my world," he said, his sob turning into a twisted chuckle. It sounded so forced, as if someone who'd never heard laughter their entire life was trying to fake it based on written-down instructions. As I descended into the basement, I felt the air around me grow thick. I felt so small, to wander beneath the heavy concrete walls and ceiling, with no one there to guide my way. The flashlight I wielded barely touched the shadows before me, and it was already starting to run dry. "Mr. Henderson?" I repeated. "Are you okay?" Once I reached the bottom, my light barely produced a visible beam. I took a break to swirl around the charging handle, desperately trying to illuminate my harrowing surroundings. After I felt I had a satisfying charge, I shone the light around the damp, dark room, expecting to find a bunch of crates or equipment. Instead, I found out the basement was far larger than I'd ever imagined. Instead of being a singular room, it was a hallway rid of any light with several metal doors lining the walls on each side. It looked almost like the ward above me, except it had no windows, nor any staff in sight. The cries were coming from a room near the end, and it was growing in intensity for each step I took towards it. It didn't even sound real anymore. It was too loud, too broken, and wet. I walked over to the door and gently pulled it open. Inside I found a singular bed with a broken chain attached to the wall. Mr. Henderson himself stood in one of the corners, just facing the wall. He let out a couple of more sobs, banging his head slowly against the cold concrete. He was naked and his body had grown sickly thin, even in comparison to how he looked shortly before his death. His ribs protruded violently through his paper-thin skin. He seemed nothing like the man I'd known, but it was still him. Then I noticed something else, a woman lying on the floor a few feet away from him. It was my mother. She was unconscious and had a large gash covering the side of her head. "Mom!" I yelled as I ran to help her. Only then did Mr. Henderson finally pay me any attention. He turned his head towards me with a jerky twist and took a few bizarrely unbalanced steps towards me. His limbs moved in inhuman ways, akin to a marionette being controlled by an unseen entity. I'm here, he half sobbed, half laughed. "Why did you come down here? You're not supposed to be here. I'm not me. I'll hurt you. You'll be the next one." He took a long, unsteady step towards me, while I frantically tried to shake my mother awake. "Why did you come down here? Why didn't you just let me die?" he yelled as he walked even closer to me. "Mom, wake up!" I yelled as I shook her knocked-out body. "Leave," Mr. Henderson shouted, taking another few doll-like steps towards me. I got to my feet and backed away from my mother. My hands were trembling at the man standing before me. Whoever he had once been, he was long since lost, and I hadn't got the faintest clue what had taken his place. "I want to die again. Why are you keeping me here?" he asked. "The acolytes will come. You are but the first vessel." One voice was Mr. Henderson's, though distraught and damaged. It felt like him, but the other one belonged to something else entirely, a dark force that filled the basement with dread. I turned to flee, but the door had shut behind me. The pathetic flashlight I carried had once again begun to fade. Left without any chance of escape, I just froze in fear, unable to comprehend the situation that was unfolding before me. Then Mr. Henderson swung his arm towards the wall. He let out a groan as a loud crack was heard. He'd broken his own arm, causing the bone to protrude out through his flesh. He lifted his mangled arm, getting ready to strike me. "I need to kill you. It'll be better for you," he said with a sob. I lifted my arms to defend myself, screaming for my mother to help me. Mr. Henderson brought down his broken bone with incredible speed. It hit my shoulder, cutting deep into my flesh. I cried in agony and... "Mom!" I was jolted awake by my son Alex standing at the foot of my bed. He wore a worried expression on his face, one I had come to know all too well in the recent weeks. "Did you have another bad dream?" he asked. I was too out of breath to respond. I just looked down at my shoulder, making sure the wound was little more than a distant memory. It still displayed the scars from the following surgery, but at least the pain had vanished years earlier. "I'm okay, Alex. It was just a dream," I lied. The truth was far too complicated for his young mind to understand. Even I hadn't come to terms with the events that took place 2 decades earlier. Officially, I had hurt myself on a piece of broken glass, but the truth still lingered in my mind. "What are you doing awake so early?" I asked as I glanced at the time. It was barely 7, early by even Alex's standards. He pointed to the stairs with a puzzled look. "There's a man outside. He says he knows my grandma." It struck me as an odd coincidence. I hadn't spoken to my mother since I was a child, so to have someone show up at my doorstep the same week as I'm having nightmares about her felt all too connected. Still, I was too tired to question it. "I'll be right down. Just go get ready for breakfast. You can have some of that cereal that you love so much." With that permission, Alex scurried away. He was only 6, but he'd already grown so much. He had a pure heart full of kindness, all in spite of the complicated life that we'd led so far. I got out of bed, still soaked in sweat from the nightmare. It felt so real, making it feel as if I'd returned to the horrible basement at Tenebris Hospice Care. The whole place was a dreadful one, the end station for people needing end-of-life care. All I could do was to splash some cold water onto my face before I threw on whatever clothes I'd worn the day before. I knew I looked like shit, but it didn't matter. Once I finally made it to the door, I found a man in his mid-30s standing outside. He wore a perfectly tailored suit with silver cufflinks. He smiled politely as he saw me, reaching out his hand to introduce himself. "My name is John Riley. You must be Miss Laura Florence." I nodded as I grabbed his hand. It was a firm handshake, but I still didn't understand whether he wanted to sell me something or if he actually knew my mother like he claimed. "I'm so sorry to interrupt you this early on a Sunday, but I'm here on behalf of Agatha Florence. She was your mother, correct?" Her name sounded so odd. No one had ever called her Agatha before. It was always Aggie by her friends, or Mrs. Florence if she spoke to patients. For a moment, I just tried to remember what she looked like. Even in my dreams, her face had always been obscured, as if she was a stranger. Then it hit me. He'd mentioned my mother in the past tense. Wait, did you say was my mother? His smile vanished as he realized he'd inadvertently told me that my mother had died. I'm so sorry, Miss Florence. Your mother passed away a month ago. I thought you already knew. The news took a moment to truly register with me. At first I felt sad, but then I realized just how long it had been since I'd last seen her. The sadness quickly faded and was replaced by an overwhelming sense of disappointment. Do you mind if I come inside for a moment? He asked. Without even thinking to refuse, I just gestured in the general direction of the kitchen. I led the way and he followed me inside. Alex had already started breakfast, working on a bowl of cereal that contained far too much sugar. Mr. Riley placed himself in the doorway, waiting patiently for permission to come inside. Alex, hon, could you give us a few minutes? You can go watch some TV while you eat. Alex excitedly rushed out of the kitchen. It was an unusual treat for him to eat on the couch, so he didn't hesitate for even a second. Please, have a seat. Would you like some coffee or something? I asked. He just shook his head. Oh, thank you, but I'm trying to cut down on my caffeine intake. Still, I mindlessly started working on a pot of coffee. Mr. Riley sat himself down by the kitchen table and put a briefcase in front of him. I'm a lawyer that used to work for the same hospice facility as your mother, Tenebris Care. You know the name? He asked. Well, I thought back to the few memories I had of the place. While they weren't particularly pleasant ones, I still felt oddly connected to it. The horrors I could remember seemed vague, as if they'd never really happened. If not for the frequent nightmares to remind me, I probably wouldn't have believed it. Oh, yeah, I spent a lot of time in one of the guest rooms. My mother was a nurse there. Mr. Riley nodded in agreement. She actually worked there as recently as last year. She meant a great deal to both the staff and patients at the facility. She was a good woman. I almost let out a chuckle at that last statement. A good woman. The person who'd abandoned me at the age of 7, sent me away to live with my grandparents. Oh, they hated her. They truly did, despite her being their own daughter. According to them, she was absolutely insane. Oh, I didn't really know her that well, was the only answer I could muster up. He looked slightly disappointed at my response. Still, he put on a kind smile and opened one of the documents. As her lawyer, it's my job to carry out her last will and testament. While she didn't have much in terms of money, she did leave behind her house and the room she owned at Tenebris Care. That's not worth a lot, but it's something. Oh, in addition, she left you this, he said as he handed me the neatly wrapped up package. It was light, but I didn't want to open it without knowing its contents. What is it? I asked. Oh, I'm not sure. It was already wrapped and addressed to you when I picked it up, he said, allowing a hint of curiosity to escape through his voice. I unwrapped the paper with trembling hands and found a heavily worn, leather-bound journal inside. On it my mother's name had been engraved as Aggie Florence. These were all her thoughts and memories that remained on this earth, all from a life I'd never known. At first I just stared at it in disbelief. I'd honestly never cared much about knowing my mother. To me, she was just the crazy woman that abandoned me as a child. But with the lawyer giving a whole different story, I was starting to doubt myself for the first time in years. Miss Florence, I know it might be a traumatic thing to relive old memories, believe me, but it'd be greatly helpful if you could accompany me back to Tenebris to get this paperwork out of the way. Then we can transfer whatever assets that belong to your mother, or at least sell them. The idea didn't bring me any joy. Tenebris was a part of my past, a place that had broken my mind as a young girl. Still, the curious bone in my mind wouldn't rest all that easy. If my mother hadn't been the psychotic woman I'd been led to believe, then why had she sent me away? Can I have some time to think about it? I finally asked. Mr. Riley nodded, understandably, and pulled out a business card from his inner pocket. It was just a plain black piece of paper with the name of his company and his phone number on it. I'm staying in town until tomorrow. Just call me if you have any questions. With that, he excused himself, and I was left alone in the kitchen. Alex was still enjoying his TV time, blaring cartoons loudly throughout the house. I should have joined him for breakfast, but I'd lost my appetite. All I wanted were answers. Answers that might be hidden within that very diary. I had to do it. I took a deep breath and opened the book to a random page, about halfway through the diary. April 18th, 1997. Mr. Clark arrived at the building today for the last time. It's only been a month since I last saw him, and now it's more clear than ever that he's standing on death's doorstep. Cancer is a horrible disease, and it's taken Mr. Clark out of remission with a vengeance, spreading to his lungs and brain. He's lost most of the brilliant man he used to be, but he still plays the piano like an angel. Even in his current state, the muscle memory lingers, a window into his former self. He's told me he's ready. The pain is too great to suffer through another round of chemo. I just hope his last few weeks in our world are less painful. I sneaked in a bit of a higher dose in his pain medication. The doctors wouldn't be happy about it, but it couldn't hurt him any more than the disease already has. The next few pages went on to describe Mr. Clark's life. He used to be a music teacher, even far enough back to have taught my own mother. I was only 4 when I'd first met him, and though I only knew him for a couple of months, I knew he was a kind man. But even the best people get taken by the horrible disease, stolen from this world without reason. I just skimmed through the next pages, surprised at just how normal my mother seemed. Based on the little I'd read in her diary that far, she was a compassionate, kind woman, just like the lawyer had said. April 19th, 1997. Mr. Clark died last night, took his last breath when I was sleeping. I promised to be there with him when the time came, but I failed him. There were just no real warning signs. He'd seemed fine the evening before, and we expected him to have at least another week left. He just died. Died in silence, without a soul noticing. He drew his last breath, and the world just didn't change. He was pronounced dead when the Morning Star found him at 5:34 a.m. Just like that. But that's not the worst part. Because when we moved him into the morgue, I accidentally touched his arm, and I could have sworn I felt it twitch. I told the other nurses to stop, but they just kept going, claiming I'd imagined the whole thing. I turned to the next page, but to my surprise, it had been ripped out. In fact, as I flipped through the rest of the diary, I found that several were missing. I went through the entire thing page by page, but without the missing information as context, it was a pointless task. Though what she left behind seemed normal enough, I couldn't know for sure without getting the rest of the diary. The business card that rested on the kitchen table started to look all the more tempting, and yet something held me back, an odd feeling I just couldn't shake, hidden somewhere beneath a heavy sense of curiosity. Had my mother really been crazy? I had to know. I picked up the card and dialed the number. At first I couldn't bring myself to hit call. I just sat there and stared at the 10-digit number. For all I knew, there was no mystery. My mother was simply crazy. But the possibility was still there, and the only thing that separated me from the answers I needed was a simple phone call. "Hello, this is John Riley. How can I help you?" he said as he picked up the phone. "Hey, it's me, Laura Florence," I responded meekly. "Oh, hello, Miss Florence. I didn't think I'd hear back from you so soon. Have you decided what to do?" "Yeah, I'm coming with you back to Tenebris." I sort of knew the way to Tenebris myself, at least with a map. Nevertheless, my car was held up in the garage as it awaited the missing parts it desperately needed for repairs. Riley offered to drive, promising that the entire trip wouldn't last more than a week, and that he'd guide me through all the necessary paperwork. That night, I couldn't let go of the diary. I combed through the old paper, trying to figure out which parts had gone missing. Most of the stuff written there seemed normal, even tame, apart from a few offhand sentences, my mother seemed like a perfectly normal person. All the answers I sought were hidden within the missing pages. I knew that much. I figured that if I couldn't read them myself, maybe some answers had been left behind in the room I'd inherited. Then, as I held the diary in my hand, I felt a small cut in the leather, just on the inside of the back page. It revealed a perfectly hidden pocket, and there was something inside it. I gently tugged and pulled on a folded piece of paper, careful not to tear it as I removed it from the pocket. It was one of the missing pages, filled to the brim with frantic handwriting. It was messy, but clearly written by my mother. The date on it was listed as August 4th, 2000, the very day I got sent to my grandparents at the age of 7. Dear Laura, they're not letting me leave Tenebris, but I can't let them take you too. I'm sending you away to live with your grandparents. Hopefully they can keep you safe as I figure out a way to stop this nightmare. There's something wrong with the people in this town. At first I thought it was just the patients at the hospice care. They kept coming back from the dead, acting strangely as if they weren't the same people anymore. But then it started to spread. People were dying all around town, only to come back to life as they'd arrived at our morgue. It's my fault. I'm a part of this, and I don't know if I can stop it. I'm hiding this note in my diary, only to be given to you once I'm dead. I pray you never have to read this, but if you do, you have to stay away from Tenebris. It's not safe here. Please forgive me. I'm going to try to... The rest of the page was smudged beyond intelligibility, as if the page had been tucked away before the ink had had a chance to dry. She was telling me to stay away, but that was over 20 years ago. If Tenebris truly was dangerous, the threat had to have been gone by now. I mulled over my options, but the desperate desire still occupied my every thought. I had to figure out what had happened to my mother. Part 2. Tenebris. I woke the following morning to the sound of Riley's car pulling up into my driveway. I groaned as I realized it wasn't even 7 o'clock. He was even earlier than the day before, but I had to get up. Sleep hadn't come easy the previous nights, not after the note I'd found hidden within the cover of the diary. It wasn't until I took my prescription sleeping medication before I finally drifted off to sleep. It wasn't something I enjoyed, especially not the morning after, but I didn't have any other options. Alex was already awake and had packed a small bag of clothes, snacks and essential items. He was well prepared, more so than myself. I quickly checked through my own bag, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything, before running downstairs to greet Riley. Even at the 11th hour, I hadn't fully decided whether or not I was going with him. I needed to ask him about my mother's warning. "Good morning, Miss Florence," Riley said as I opened the door. "We have a long drive ahead. Are you sure you have everything you need?" He looked fresh, despite wearing exactly the same suit as the day before. "Mr. Riley, I'm not sure this is a good idea. It's just, well..." I felt embarrassed to even say it, so I just handed him the letter. He skimmed over it. As he progressed down each paragraph, he started to look almost sad, as if he pitied my mother. "I'm sorry. Your mum, as great of a woman as she was, had a few, episodes. It's not all she was. She was great, but she had dark moments like everyone else. If you've ever changed your mind, I understand. It's difficult to relive the past." He looked at me, expecting an answer. The thought of my mother being crazy returned to me at record pace. But even if she was, I still needed to collect her belongings. "It's all right. We'll come with you." And with that, he opened the trunk to his car, grabbing Alex's bag first and throwing it in. "Won't it be a bit uncomfortable, travelling around in such a fancy suit?" I asked, half joking in an attempt at being friendly. He looked down at himself for a moment and chuckled. "I always dress like this when I'm out and about on business. Makes me feel better about myself, I suppose." Dressed like the man you want to be? I asked. Well, my boss always says we're all wearing costumes, that our true nature is hidden beneath the clothes we wear, the makeup we put on and, well, the faces we fake to convince people we're fine. What you see a person as is hardly ever who they truly are. If that's the case, then I figure it may as well be a good costume. I chuckled awkwardly back at his comment, reaching down to lift up my bag, but Riley got there before me. Don't worry, I'm an excellent driver, Riley said. As I opened the passenger side door, my finger somehow got caught in the handle, twisting it around. Oh, fuck, I yelled in pain, immediately realizing that Alex was standing right next to me. Oh, sorry, hon. We're not supposed to say these things. He just laughed in response. Bad words were peak humor for children his age. I can blow on it to make it better, he suggested. I agreed it was a silly tradition that we'd developed. He gently held my hand and blew on the aching finger. Somehow it actually took the pain away, whether it was just placebo or because it really wasn't that wounded. Riley got out from his car and came over to assist me. Everything all right, Miss Florence? He asked. Yeah, I just twisted my finger. I'm fine. The journey would last all of 12 hours, leading us into the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. As we started driving, Alex instantly fell back asleep, but I wasn't that lucky. Despite having built up a significant sleep debt over the last few months, I just couldn't find rest. Instead, I just took a moment to stare at the ever-changing landscape outside the window. As I stared outside, I absent-mindedly kept flicking the lid off the old Zippo lighter. It had been in my pocket for years by then, though I'd never even used it. You smoke? Riley asked. No, I mumbled as I put the lighter away. It was my mother's, just one of those things I took when I was sent away. I wanted to ask Riley more about my mother, but I'd just met the guy, and for all I knew, he might have just been a lawyer who'd met her once or twice. You want to ask me about your mother, don't you? He said after a long moment of silence. I have to be honest, I didn't know her all that well, just what I've been told, but I'll help you in any way I can. Well, he was either psychic or incredibly intuitive. I supposed he would have understood how people work to be a good lawyer. Still, I was afraid to ask. Either she was crazy and the whole journey would be a reminder of my broken childhood, or she wasn't, which meant I was the one who'd given up on her. After a single moment of thought, all I could think to ask was she happy? The question plunged the car into silence. Riley sighed, not out of awkwardness, nor shame, but because he pitied me. I think she was just lonely. Riley was a man of few words, a fact well proven by the long trip we had together. He never really spoke unless someone prompted him. Still, he usually knew exactly the right words to use. I felt oddly comfortable around him, but whether that trust came because of his character or because he was the only link to my mother, I didn't know. The journey went on with only occasional stops to use the restroom and to get a snack. Alex was usually the culprit, with his tiny bladder and needing to move around. Riley didn't seem to mind much. He'd just stand by the car and politely wait for us to finish our business. As we got closer to Tenebris, the world around us slowly started to change. Civilization gave way to open fields, and the road that had brought us there transformed to cracked asphalt, forgotten by time itself. Above in the sky hung heavy clouds that had been trapped in by the valley that surrounded us, creating a cold and eerie atmosphere. Though it was only 5 in the afternoon, it was already starting to get dark. Is that small diner still around here? I asked as I felt my stomach rumble. Which one? Riley asked. I think it was called Jonathan's Breakfast, Lunch and Dinner. Not a particularly creative name, but if I recall, they had decent omelets. I think so. I'm pretty sure there's something somewhere along the road here. It was odd that he didn't recognize the name. Tenebris was a tiny place with only a handful of pubs, restaurants, and diners. Jonathan's was usually the only place me and my mother had gone out to eat, a treat reserved for special occasions. Riley pulled up onto the parking lot. The place hadn't changed a bit since last time, matching my memories down to the smallest detail. but it also seemed so old, unkempt, and abandoned. While the lights were on inside, it both looked and felt like no one had set foot there in years. "I'll just hang out by the car and make some phone calls. I'll see you in a bit," Riley said. "You don't want us to get you anything? You haven't eaten all day." "Thanks, I'm good. Travel just makes me a bit nauseated." And with that, we went inside. Alex ordered his favourite food, French fries with an overabundance of ketchup, while I got myself an omelette. The waitress seemed tired and unsure of how to deal with customers. Still, the food was brought to us quickly enough, and I didn't really care apart from that. The diner was empty, not a single soul accompanying us in the large interior. The tables were dusty, and the radio had been turned off. It was an unwelcoming atmosphere, but we just needed food before heading off. Alex started digging in, but I hesitated with trying the eggs. The smell of sulphur lingered in the air, one I could quickly trace back to the eggs. They were rotten, that much was obvious. The eggs must have been months past their expiration date, which would be an almost impossible feat for any diner. I pushed them to the side, too sick from the smell to even demand another plate. The fries looked rather old themselves. They were clearly frozen products and deep-fried, so I doubted they were as bad as the eggs. Still, they seemed soggy. I stole one from Alex, much to his dismay, and tasted it just to make sure he wouldn't get sick. "Mom, why haven't we visited Grandma before?" Alex asked between mouthfuls of fries. I had to think about the answer for a moment. It was an easy question, but not something a kid should have to deal with. "Well, when I was your age, your grandma had some problems, so I was taken away for a while." "Were you sad?" I chuckled. "Yeah, I was sad, but now I have you, and that's much more important." The staff at the diner, wherever they'd gone, never came back to check on our table. We just put some money down and left the building. I was still hungry, but it would have to wait until we got into town. "Is it still far?" Alex asked as I put him into the back seat. "We'll be there in 5 minutes, buddy," I answered. "You'll even get your own room." As we got further into town, thousands of memories started flowing back. I saw the playground I'd spent most of my free time at. Only then, the swing was broken and weeds had taken over the sandbox. A lot of the houses remained unchanged, only with flaky paint and a few broken windows. Honestly, the town had never been well kept. It was a poor place, but since my last visit, it had gotten even worse. "What happened here?" I asked. "This place used to be, well, less depressing." Riley sighed. "Yeah, a lot of people have left town in recent years. Couldn't tell you why. I don't really think anything changed. Probably just the younger generation going to the big cities, hoping to find their meaning in life." When we arrived at my old neighborhood, it was run down, standing in perfect harmony with the rest of the aging town. On the side of the street stood a patrol car with an officer checking the streets. As Riley parked his car, the officer approached us. I instantly recognized him as Sheriff Morgan Dawson, the very same I'd known back when I was a kid. "I see you brought some guests," he stated coldly as he saw Riley. Sheriff Dawson redirected his attention towards me, inspecting me with suspicious eyes. "Is that—" "Yeah, that's Miss Laura Florence, just here to deal with some paperwork." The sheriff's expression immediately changed to a friendly smile. "Aggie's daughter, you're back in Tenebris," he said as if he couldn't quite believe it. I nodded, glad to see a familiar face, but still a bit freaked out by being back in town. Sheriff Dawson glanced over at Riley with suspicious eyes, but he quickly redirected his attention towards me. "Well, I didn't know you were coming. Well, I'm truly sorry about your loss. Aggie was a great woman, one of the best I ever knew. It's been a rough month since her passing." "Oh, thank you, Sheriff Dawson. I appreciate it." "Morgan," he corrected me. He then fumbled around in his pocket for a moment, before pulling out a business card. "If you need anything during your stay, don't hesitate to contact me. This is my personal number, so anytime you need assistance, call." It sounded more like an order than a suggestion. Though he was perfectly friendly, he seemed overly protective of me, despite barely knowing me. Then he turned to Alex, who was getting his things out from the car. "Who's this little guy?" he asked. "That's my son, Alex." He bent down to be on the same eye level as Alex, and reached out to shake his hand. "I'm the sheriff around these parts. My job's to keep everyone safe, but I guess you'll take good care of your mother, huh?" Alex chuckled, nodding in agreement. He took a look at my luggage, dropped in front of the house. "Oh, you're staying at Aggie's old place?" he asked. I nodded. I hadn't thought about other options. Sure, there were some cheap and unsanitary hotels available, but I was there to figure things out. I needed to be close to my mother, or at least as close as I could get. "Right, don't forget she has a room at the hospice. Might be a bit better kept than the house. She spent most of her time away from home, as you know," Riley interjected. He was right. I hardly had any memories from our old house. Since babysitters weren't readily available, my mother had brought me with her to work, where I stayed at her room in Tenebra's care most of the time. It was probably nicer, but it wasn't a place I wished Alex to stay overnight. "Thank you. We'll be checking out the room tomorrow." "You'll be there for the memorial as well?" Riley asked. I looked back at him with a confused expression. "What memorial?" "We're holding one in Agatha's honor. A final goodbye, if you will." "Are you going to be there, Sheriff?" I asked. He shook his head. No, I've got my own way of honoring her, but I'll pick you up tomorrow and drive you over there." Then he turned to Riley. "That'll be all right, won't it?" He nodded in agreement. "I suppose so." There was clear tension between the two of them, but if they had some history or bad blood that I didn't know about, I thought it best to stay out of trouble. I drive past here every morning anyway. Should we say 7? "Sure. Thank you, Sheriff." "Please just call me Morgan," he corrected for the second time. With that, the sheriff got back into his car and drove away. Riley went to unlock the front door, after which he handed us the key. The house had been left exactly as I remembered it, old and hardly ever used by anyone. A thick layer of dust had gathered on every available surface, causing a dense cloud to form wherever we went. I coughed as we walked through the hallway into the living room. That too was untouched, only affected by the never-ending passage of time itself. However, as we reached the kitchen, I realized it was squeaky clean. Every surface had been polished and disinfected, and on the kitchen table lay a letter without a name. "What's this?" I asked. Riley scratched his head. I think it's for you." I opened the letter up, only to find a piece of paper that clearly held my mother's handwriting. Riley must have noticed the change in my demeanor, because he suddenly looked uncomfortable. "I'll leave you two alone to get acquainted with the house again. You have my number if you need anything." "Okay, I'll see you again tomorrow for the paperwork," I asked as he retreated back towards the front door. "Yeah, we'll meet around noon, after the ceremony." "Ceremony? I thought you said memorial." "Yeah, memorial, yeah. I'll see you tomorrow." Once Riley had left, I read the letter. It was a pretty generic will left behind, explaining that all her belongings would pass to me. Not a single word held personal meaning, nor did it give me closure of any kind. I noticed Alex almost falling asleep on the kitchen table. The journey had worn him out, and it was time to sleep. I started cleaning his room out, but he resisted, demanding that we stay together in one room. I couldn't blame him. The place was awfully old and creepy. Besides, it'd be easier just to clean out one room, as tired as we were. By the time we'd removed all the dust, Alex had already passed out in bed. I myself wasn't tired. I pulled the last sets of covers off my pillow when I noticed a piece of paper fall out. It was crumpled, made from thick, aging paper that matched what I'd seen in the diary. I caressed it, gently holding it in my hands as if it could turn to dust at any moment. It had a torn edge which matched perfectly the last page of my mother's journal. I put them side by side just to make sure. Well, the text was more erratic than the previous pages, written with messy letters, filling up both sides of the paper to the brim. I could barely decipher it. I'd only gotten about halfway through the page when a horrible realization hit me. My mother hadn't just died. She had killed herself. Part 3. What Lies Below. I sat frozen on my bedside, clutching onto my mother's suicide letter. These were the last words she left behind in this world, her final thoughts before departing forever. Her handwriting was erratic, a mess of jumbled words that hardly conveyed a proper meaning. It stood in stark contrast to the rest of the journal, which had been carefully written down, marking each event of her life. Then I began to read over it again, tears forming in my eyes, my heart weighing heavy. She'd never gotten to say goodbye. No final words exchanged between us, just 100 unanswered questions, and a life I couldn't possibly understand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It's all my fault. I've opened the gateway to a different world, a place that no one was ever supposed to see. I brought them back, these monsters. I failed to stop it. I couldn't defeat them. All I ever wanted was to bring peace to those on the edge of life, to give them one final moment of happiness before they passed over to the other side. When I first realized I could bring them back from death, I was hailed as a miracle worker. But these aren't miracles. They're curses, monsters from another realm. These acolytes, they're not here to save us. They're taking over Tenebris, and they're using me to do it. I tried to stop, tried to leave, but they won't let me. I can't escape, I can't get away from Tenebris. I'm so sorry, but there's only one way to stop this. I need to die. I can't be responsible for more suffering. I'm going to end it the only way I can. May God have mercy on you all. Those were the last thoughts running through my mother's head as she left our world behind. A crazy rant I still couldn't believe. There wasn't any further closure, no message left behind for me, just the scrambled words of a broken mind, put down on a ripped-out page of the diary. I didn't know why she'd hidden it, or, more importantly, whom she'd hidden it from. I wanted to call Sheriff Dawson and ask if my mother had truly lost it, but as I fumbled around for my phone, I realized it was gone. I'd probably dropped it somewhere in Riley's car. Without it, I could do nothing save wait for morning to roll around. That night, I didn't feel like sleeping. I just laid there in bed, holding onto the letter as I desperately tried to decipher what was going through her mind, how much of it was real, and why she hadn't tried to reach out during all the years before her death. Her diary provided few answers, with so many of the pages ripped out. I needed to find them. I needed to know if there was any truth to her frantic rambles. But despite the overwhelming anxiety I felt about Tenebris, my eyes eventually started to wear heavy. Our bed felt cold, and the house was all too foreign, even with its familiar creaks and strange drafts of wind. It prevented my tired mind from simply slipping away. It was a bizarre sensation, to be in a place filled with so many familiar artifacts and memories, but to feel as if I didn't belong. Alex, on the other hand, felt safe beside me. He was resting peacefully, with his chest gently moving up and down to the rhythm of his breathing. To be that innocent and unaware of all the horrors in the world was an emotion I'd long since forgotten. I envied him right then. He was unfamiliar with my complicated past. I'd sheltered him from the horrors in the world so far, but I feared his innocence might not last for very long. There was something dark lingering in the air of Tenebris, and just the thought of having Alex beside me was a worrisome one. Whether my mother was crazy or telling the truth, something was wrong about this town. I turned over in bed just to look at him, afraid he might vanish if I took my eyes off him for just a second. Alex was the last bit of family I had left, a part of myself that might still have the chance to enjoy all the beauty the world had to offer. I needed to protect him, to keep him safe. As I shifted in bed, Alex moved over ever so slightly. At first, I thought I'd awoken him, but then he said something that sent shivers down my spine. "Mom," I don't like the crying man, Alex mumbled, half asleep. Well, I thought he had to be dreaming, but the words were so familiar. I put a hand on his head and brushed my fingers gently through his hair. He needed a haircut, that much was for sure, but those were priorities for a different time. It's okay, Alex. You're just having a dream. I uttered the words with such certainty, but then I felt the goosebumps rising on my arms. For some inexplicable reason beyond my understanding, I was afraid. And then I heard it. The distinct sounds of a grown man loudly sobbing. He was far away, I could tell that much, but between each cry he seemed to be getting closer. His voice echoed down the empty streets outside. They rung through the air, filling it with unfathomable dread. It was just like what I'd heard back at the hospice care, back when I'd found Mr. Henderson in the basement. But the cries weren't ones of sadness, anger, or fear. As a kid, I'd naturally connected sobs with negative feelings. Yet there were no emotions hidden behind the man's calls. He simply sounded broken, and he was getting closer. I want to die again. It hurts to be here. Why am I here? He cried, before briefly switching to a wet, hoarse laugh. We will come. You will be our vessels. Just like Mr. Henderson, he was talking to himself, alternating between twisted sobs and sickening laughter. I walked carefully over to the window, parting the curtains just to take a quick peek outside. Since we were in the outskirts of town, there were few street lamps to speak of. All I could see outside was the silhouette of a tall, twisted man wandering down the road. Where he'd come from and what he wanted, I couldn't tell, nor did I care to find out. Despite the darkness, I could tell he was hurt. His limbs had been twisted in unnatural directions, and he limped with bizarre steps, each seeming elongated as if controlled by invisible strings. Mom, who's that man? Alex asked, finally awoken from the disturbing sounds. I don't know, was all I could think to respond. Is he sad? Strangely enough, Alex didn't seem afraid. He was, rather, filled with concern for the crying man on the street. I don't think so, I said. The sounds were bringing back memories I'd tried to repress for so long. All the nightmares I'd experienced in the past few months were all coming true. I'd always known they were more than mere dreams, but to hear the crying once again was too much. Shouldn't we help him? Alex asked. No, honey. Just stay in bed. There's nothing we can do for him, I said as I slowly closed the curtains. We just have to stay real quiet. Alex complied without asking any further questions. He'd always been good like that, at least with me. We just lay in bed awaiting sleep to overcome our tired minds. The crying man slowly made his way further down the road, eventually fading away into the darkness as his voice got out of range. I let out a sigh of relief, and after another hour passed, I finally drifted off to sleep. I woke to the sound of knocking on the door. Confused, I turned to face the clock, only to realize the battery had died. I'd overslept, and Alex was still snoring next to me. During the course of the night, he turned 90 degrees in bed, lying across both mattresses with his face planted in the sheets. Laura? A voice called out from downstairs. Sorry, the door was open. Are you ready? It was Sheriff Dawson, ready to pick us up for the memorial. He was standing ready in the entrance hall, already dressed in his uniform. It was odd, as I could clearly remember locking the door the night before. Being paranoid about break-ins had hammered home that habit. Still, having the sheriff escorting me around made me feel a bit more at ease. Though it had been 20 years since I'd last seen him, I had nothing but fond memories of the man. He'd always been around at events and gatherings, making sure everyone got home safe, and never shied away from lending a helping hand. On top of it all, he just might have answers regarding my mother. Good morning, Sheriff, I said with a groggy voice. Alex tugged on my shirt, gesturing for me to bend down to his level. He said to call him Morgan, he whispered into my ear. I almost let out a chuckle, but I was too tired to truly appreciate his concern. "Oh, I'm sorry, the alarm seems to have died, and we were up quite late." "Up late? Did anything happen?" I thought about it for a moment. It sounded all too surreal to even mention without seeming crazy. "Well, there was a man outside. He was crying and screaming. The sheriff frowned. "You heard that, did you?" he asked. I just nodded in return, surprised he knew what I was talking about. "I'm sorry, Laura. There are a few disturbed individuals roaming around town. We're working on solving the problem, but I promise that you're safe here." Alex went back to his room, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. He'd already gotten dressed in a shirt, formal enough for a memorial, but he needed to brush his teeth, a dangerous task when already dressed. I got myself ready in a hurry. We drove further into town together, towards the hospice care that I hadn't seen in years. "How close were you and my mother, really?" I finally asked the sheriff. Pretty close. We grew up in the same neighborhood. I was a bit older than her, even babysat her from time to time when we were both kids. She was a very special woman, your mother. It truly pains me to see her go." "Do you know what happened to her?" He looked over at me with a look of pity in his eyes. "They didn't tell you?" I took the suicide letter up from my pocket. "I found this in the house." Sheriff Dawson sighed. "Aggie was a great woman, but she was troubled. That much I can't deny. Not that it was her fault. She didn't choose what she was given. I just never thought it would come to this. The town desperately needed someone like her." "What do you mean, someone like her?" I asked. "Well, she was gifted. I'm not going to lie and say only good came from it, but she never meant anyone any harm." His words, though clearly words of praise, didn't sit right with me. But before I could ask any further questions, Alex interrupted us with his own observations. "Where are all the people?" he asked. That was the first time I'd noticed just how empty the streets felt. Though Tenebris had always been a small town, it hadn't ever been lacking in terms of shops, kiosks, and crowded markets. It just seemed like everything had closed down, with the buildings run down and the population tired. Of the few people we actually saw, most looked so old, as if there hadn't been a kid born in town for decades. Tenebris Care, however, was as polished as it had ever been. It was an old building with classic Victorian-style architecture. It stood in stark contrast to the semi-modern buildings in the rest of town. All of them were so simple-looking, built only for their purpose and not to look good. An elderly woman stood outside the gates to the hospice care, ready to greet us. I instantly recognized her as the head nurse, Mrs. Marianne Crawford. She looked exactly the same as I'd last seen her 20 years ago, but she had to be in her late 70s by then. She gave a friendly smile as she approached the car. "Oh, you must be Laura," she half asked, half stated. Her smile seemed only half genuine, which was still very unlike the stern woman I'd known growing up. She'd always been so strict then, never happy about me roaming the hallways or interacting with the patients. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Crawford," I said, and I truly meant it. Though I'd never liked her, just seeing something familiar amid the eerie atmosphere was a welcome gift. "I'm so sorry about your mother. Agatha truly was a gifted woman." The sheriff got a call on his radio and excused himself. "I've got to take this. You have my number if you need me, Laura." With that, we went inside, ready to celebrate my mother's life. It'd be the first time I'd set foot in the facility since I was a child. Not much had changed. The seemingly endless hallways were still only illuminated by the same ancient light bulbs, and the furniture looked identical. The entire place smelled of age, medication, and death. It wasn't a pleasant environment, but no place filled with death ever is. The only noticeable difference was the paintings. They used to be representations of religious scenes, but they'd been replaced by abstract art I couldn't quite put my finger on. They were dark red with pale lines running in every which direction through them. Just looking at them caused distressing emotions to arise, not something I would have imagined suitable for hospice care. Mrs. Crawford led us down the hallways, helping us navigate to the main common area where we'd hold the ceremony. Last time I'd been there, the halls always seemed so full of life, an ironic observation in a place meant for death. But there had been whole families there, visiting their loved ones, and staff that tried their best to defeat the somber atmosphere. All that was gone now, and everything had fallen quiet. The building felt all too barren, rid of all life. A bit quiet here these days, I asked, trying to break the ice. It's still the same old place you grew up in. Even most of the staff have remained the same. Not many young people are willing to up their roots and move to such a small town. It used to be a problem, but we're doing well enough these days. She was right. The entire population was growing old. I would have assumed to meet many new faces upon my return, but I could recognize most of the nurses and doctors. They'd already seemed old to me as a kid, but there they were, 20 years later, as if not a single day had passed. Once we reached my mother's old ward, I felt the familiar dread form in my chest. It was the same hallway that frequently haunted my nightmares. The memories of darkness, the basement at the end, and the hopeless crying. These were the thoughts that still lingered in the back of my mind. Then we passed my mother's guest room. It still had her name attached to it with rusted metal letters. Though it had never been our home, we had spent an inordinate amount of time here. "Can I check out the room for a minute?" I asked. "After the ceremony," Mrs. Crawford insisted. I thought it odd that the building had been designed in such a way that we had to traverse the entire facility just to get to the common area. It meant that the family members had to cross a ward full of death just to get to the visiting section. I knew it was an old building repurposed for something greater, but it still bothered me. But before long, we finally got to the ceremonial room. There were about 24 people there, already seated, without speaking a word. They stared at us when we entered, but still didn't greet us. No further acknowledgement of our presence. So many people, all there to pay their respects to my mother, and I still felt out of place. "Please, take a seat," Mrs. Crawford said as she pointed to a couple of chairs. The guests kept staring at us when we sat down in our designated seats. I could recognize a few of them. They'd been patients needing end-of-care life, but that was 20 years earlier. The fact that they were still breathing seemed beyond the realm of possibility. I tried to convince myself that they were just family members that looked the same, and that the memory of a 7-year-old wasn't a reliable one. "Everyone stay seated. We'll begin shortly," Mrs. Crawford said as she took her place at the front of the room. For a moment she just stood there in silence, almost seeming to savor the moment. Then a couple of people dimmed the lights and lit candles made from red wax. The light they produced reminded me of the paintings in the lobby, causing the same dread I'd felt as I'd entered the building. Once the room was sufficiently dark, it felt as if I'd left my childhood home and entered a new world I didn't recognize. The people around me, even those I'd known before, suddenly turned into strangers. Their faces didn't change, but the aura surrounding them was completely off. I grabbed Alex's hand in panic, only snapping back to reality as he winced from the squeeze. "Oh, let go of my hand," he demanded. Alex didn't seem to notice the strange atmosphere in the room, despite the fact that not a person had uttered a single word apart from Mrs. Crawford. I couldn't stand the silence. "Today, we honor Agatha Florence," Mrs. Crawford said, finally breaking the deafening silence. "Today we honor Agatha Florence," the crowd repeated. She was our Nephilim, the gift to the acolytes. Again the crowd repeated what Mrs. Crawford had said. She granted new life among death. For that she will be remembered. I looked around me, not sure whether to partake or just observe the events unfolding in the room. Life is a frail thing, a fact well known among humans. We shall not fall into that trap. We will be strong. The people kept repeating each and every word she spoke. But following that last sentence, she changed to a language I didn't understand. Well, to me it sounded Latin or Greek, but I didn't have enough linguistic skills to say for sure. They all chanted different phrases, but one kept reappearing. De morte ad vitam, de morte ad vitam, de morte ad vitam. It went on for a couple of minutes before silence suddenly refilled the room. I sat in both awe and nervous anticipation, wondering what would come next. But no more chants were called out. Instead, they just kept sitting there, for minutes on end, with their eyes closed. Alex had also started to look afraid. He squeezed my hand hard, but despite the bizarre events occurring before us, it didn't seem like we were in any immediate danger. And then, as quickly as it all began, it ended. The room remained silent and the candles started to extinguish themselves, having burned little more than 15 minutes. The smell they'd left behind was unfamiliar, a scent I couldn't readily identify. It was akin to the smell of a room that had been freshly cleaned out after the passing of a patient, a mixture of death and soap that not even time could wash away. Mrs. Crawford started heading towards the exit, and the rest of the crowd finally stood up, still not speaking freely. I basically ran over to stop her, hoping to get some answers. She turned as she saw me try to navigate the mass of people, almost stumbling over. "Miss Florence, how did you find the ceremony?" Well, I didn't want to be callous, but I couldn't just let the strange chanting slip by. "What exactly was that?" I asked, a bit ruder than I'd intended. "I understand this might all seem foreign to you. That's one of the reasons why I wanted you to come. You need to know just how important Agatha was to this community. Her gift, her ability to save bodies so close to death, is something rarely heard of in this world. I'll explain it all to you, but only once the time has come. You need to be ready first." "Once I'm ready for what?" I began to ask, before I realized Alex had vanished from his seat. I'd only taken my eyes off him for a second, but that was enough to let him vanish out of sight. "Alex," I called out. Then I turned back to Mrs. Crawford. "Did you see where my son went?" She shook her head. I quickly scanned the room for him before I rushed to the door, exiting into the hallway. Even there, Alex was nowhere in sight. "Alex!" I called out again as adrenaline rapidly built up in my blood. The people had all left the room, but hadn't entered the same hallway as myself. It was eerily quiet, and I couldn't decide which way to run. Then I heard something echoing through the empty halls, a child's laugh. It was coming from the direction of the basement, and I instinctively knew Alex had gone down there. I started running towards the sound of laughter. It wasn't a natural one, the kind you'd expect from children playing around. No, it was hollow, just like the crying. It sounded like someone faking emotion, but not being able to put proper emphasis in the right places. The door to the basement was wide open, showing little more than a void of darkness inside. I rushed towards it, calling out for Alex, but my calls were drowned out by the laughter of emotionless children. But before I could even reach the basement door, a large figure came running out towards me, carrying Alex in his arms. It was Sheriff Dawson, who'd returned from his call just in time to grab my son. "Laura, What happened?" I asked. "I'm sorry, Mom," Alex said. "I just wanted to play with the children." The sheriff gave me a concerned look. "I'm sorry, Laura. I saw your kid go into the basement. I just went down to bring him back. They're quite strict about allowing people in there." By then, the commotion had caught the attention of Mrs. Crawford, who came over to check what was going on. "I'm sorry," Alex repeated. I held my arm around him as I looked questioningly at Mrs. Crawford. "Sorry, I only took my eyes off him for a second. He doesn't usually run away like that." "That's all right, Miss Florence. Did he go into the basement?" I nodded. She then redirected her attention towards Alex, who was clutching onto my leg. "What did you see down there?" she asked firmly. Alex was too nervous to respond. "Well, I caught him just as he descended the staircase. Just let it slide, Marianne," Sheriff Dawson interjected. Mrs. Crawford wore a stern expression on her face, just like I'd remembered her as a child. But it didn't seem plain strict, but almost malicious in its intent. "What exactly is down in the basement?" I asked. "That's really not for you to ask at this time. Whatever's down there belongs to us." I looked pleadingly at the sheriff, hoping he'd help me out. Instead, he just shook his head, gesturing for me to let it go. I obliged without further questions. I felt afraid, but it had definitely been children laughing from down in the basement. I was starting to realize that Tenebris might not be safe anymore. "Let's just move on. I'll show you to your mother's old room." Part 4. What was left behind. Mrs. Crawford led us further on in silence. She was angry at Alex for trying to enter the basement, but her refusal to answer even the most basic question about the place had only further ignited my curiosity. Before long, we stood by the door to my mother's room. The letters were rusted and had clearly been neglected even before my mother's death. Dawson looked nervous. He kept looking over his shoulder, then back at Mrs. Crawford, who wore her usual annoyed expression. "I trust you can inspect the room without assistance?" she asked. "Me and Sheriff Dawson need to have a talk." I nodded anxiously as a response. With that, she just unlocked the door and ushered Alex and myself inside, before shutting it behind us. The room looked the same as I remembered it, a perfect window into my partially forgotten childhood. Not a single thing had changed, down to each piece of furniture and some stains on the carpet I myself had created when I was 6. Alex ran inside, happy to escape the scolding stare of Mrs. Crawford. Once there, he finally eased up a bit. Still, I needed to know what exactly had happened to him down in the basement. "Why did you run away?" I asked him, as kindly as I could. His frown returned. He looked more guilty than scared. "The children told me to come with them. They said I had to." "What children?" They're not really children," he responded meekly. "What do you mean? What are they then?" "Well, they're kids like me, but then the acolytes changed them. Now they're something else." That word sounded familiar. It was something Mrs. Crawford had briefly mentioned during the memorial, but its meaning remained a mystery. "Who are the acolytes?" "I don't know. They'd just say they'd hurt you if I didn't go with them." If it hadn't been for the children's laughter I'd heard, I wouldn't have believed him. It shouldn't have been more than his overactive imagination at play, but things in Tenebris weren't like they were supposed to be. Why would they hurt me? Because of me. They wanted to kill you. I was left speechless by his last statement. The children said that. Alex just nodded. "Alex, I need to know exactly what you saw. Can you please describe it for me?" By then he was looking down at the ground, avoiding eye contact. He didn't want to respond, which said more about the place itself than whatever he could have described. I needed to get him out of the hospice care as soon as possible, but first I needed to check something. As a child, I'd frequently gotten candies and other small things from the patients. Unfortunately for me, my mother had a strict no-sugar rule, so whenever I got a hold of a piece of candy, I decided to hide it. One of the old cupboards had a loose plank, which I could easily dislodge even as a kid. I used to hide the forbidden snacks inside a small space at the back of the cupboard, hoping to eat them when my mother wasn't watching. Alas, I wasn't very slick, and she almost always caught me. It became a running joke, one we both enjoyed. Among all the hardship I remembered from my childhood, that was one of the few fond memories I had of us together. Since the place hadn't changed, I figured it might be worth a look. If my mother had left something behind for me, she just might have hidden it in our secret stash. I walked into my old bedroom, and sure enough, the cupboard was still there. Without hesitation, I pried open the back side and stuck my hand inside. The hole had seemed so big as a child, a place fitting for an endless amount of ill-gotten goods. But now it was all too small. I could barely fit my hand inside. Then I felt something, the familiar touch of paper against my skin. I struggled a bit, but eventually managed to pull out a bundle of tied-together papers. Just like the suicide notes, they had torn edges and were made from the same type of paper as the journal itself. I didn't need to inspect the room any further. Money or not, it wasn't worth sticking around. My plan was to talk to Riley, sign whatever documents he had ready, and leave town with the full journal. Once we left the room, Mrs. Crawford and Dawson were still talking in the hallway. "Leaving so soon?" Mrs. Crawford asked, trying to put on a fake smile. "Yes, unfortunately I have to go over to the house before returning back home. I need to get back to work and so on," I said, trying to sound casual. "Before you leave, Laura, there's something I'd like to talk to you about regarding your mother." "Why don't you just tell me now?" "It'd be better if we could discuss that in private. It's a complicated situation." I thought about the offer. I couldn't hurt to hear her out, but there was little I wanted more than to just leave. If I just agreed to her meeting, then fled town, no one could ever stop me. "When can we talk then?" "How about tomorrow morning? You come by the hospice and I'll tell you everything you want to know about her." I looked over to Alex, not willing to let him out of my sight again. I agreed to the meeting, still not sure if I'd show up at all. We left the building and I looked for my phone so I could give Riley a call. It was almost noon and I desperately needed to sign the papers and escape. But my phone was missing, a fact I'd forgotten during the craziness of the day. It was probably still laying around somewhere inside Riley's car. I just turned to Dawson, hoping he could help me out. "Sheriff, do you have a phone I can borrow?" "Sorry, I only have my radio when on duty. I'm sure you can use the landline in the lobby, though." The mere thought of re-entering the clinic made me shudder, but I didn't have much of a choice. I went back inside and called Riley. "Hello, this is John Riley. How may I help you?" "Hi, it's me, Laura." "Oh, hello, Miss Florence. Sorry I didn't call you earlier. I've been backed up at work. I actually wanted to ask if we could postpone our meeting until tomorrow. Something urgent came up." I sighed, but agreed. I wanted to leave that day, but since Mrs. Crawford had insisted that we meet again, I might as well stay until morning. As long as I could avoid the hospice, at least. That way I could spend the rest of the day just sorting out the ripped pages. Sheriff Dawson took us home and offered to give us a lift if we wanted to go anywhere else. He kept insisting that we call him if anything happened, almost as if he expected something horrible. Before I sorted out the diary, I had to deal with Alex. It was an easy enough task. I simply put him in front of the television, which would buy me at least a couple of hours. It wasn't the best method of parenting, but these were extraordinary circumstances that called for alternative means, and Alex certainly didn't mind. Just touching the paper felt odd. It was the last bit of my mother that still existed in this world. It astonished me that something so simple could contain the entire life of a whole person. It took me about half an hour just to reassemble the book. I put it down in front of me, taking a moment to admire the work I'd done. It was finally time to figure out what my mother had so desperately tried to hide. April 19th, 1997. Mr. Clark died last night. Took his last breath while I was sleeping. I promised to be there with him when the time came, but I failed him. There were just no real warning signs. He'd seemed fine the evening before, and we expected him to have at least another week left. He just died in silence without a soul noticing. He drew his last breath, and the world just didn't change. He was pronounced dead when the Morning Star found him at 5:34 a.m., just like that. But that's not the worst part, because when they moved him to the morgue, I accidentally touched his arm, and I could have sworn I felt it twitch. I told the other nurses to stop, but they just kept going, claiming I'd imagined the whole thing. I double-checked to see if the ripped-out segment fit, and I continued reading. I just couldn't let it go, so I sneaked into the pathology lab as they were starting the autopsy. He wasn't breathing, and his skin looked as pale as any other corpse I'd ever seen. I was starting to think I might have just imagined this whole thing, ready to leave the room before they made the first incision. He shouldn't have needed an autopsy, but his family insisted, claiming his death to be preventable, despite all scans proving he had advanced cancer. The pathologist brought out the bone saw, ready to cut through his sternum. I couldn't watch, so I rushed out the door. But just as it closed behind me, Mr. Clark sat up straight and started screaming in agony. He was still alive. It didn't necessarily mean that the doctors were wrong, but he'd somehow come back from the brink of death. It was a miracle. They quickly sent him to surgery to repair the damage. Well, I guess I'll know more tomorrow. I still remembered Mr. Clark. I'd met him when I was only 4 years old. He was actually one of the first patients I ever met at Tenebra's care. Though his mind was far gone, I spent hours just listening to him play the piano in the lobby while my mother worked. It was pretty much the only thing he could still do. Oh, he always seemed so tired, but not in a sickly way, more like he was ready for bed, getting his well-earned rest. He was a good man, so reading about his live dissection was a horrible thought that almost made me gag. But if he'd lived, then why hadn't I ever seen him again? I had to continue reading. April 21st, 1997. A couple of doctors came to visit me today. They wanted to talk about Mr. Clark's miraculous revival. When I asked why they wanted me, they simply said I had the most exposure to the patient and that I might be able to help them figure things out. Of course, I agreed. I thought of the man as a friend, and if I could aid in his recovery in any way, who was I to say no? They brought me to a rehabilitation facility just at the outskirts of town. Mr. Clark had been isolated in his own room, with restraints pinning him down to the bed. He didn't move, he just lay there and stared lifelessly up at the ceiling above him. I asked them why they'd tied him up, to which they just shrugged and said he had a couple of violent outbursts. It was mainly for his own protection, but they also warned me not to get too close. The idea seemed ridiculous at the time. Mr. Clark was so unbelievably frail, he couldn't possibly lift a finger to hurt anyone. Then I saw the pair of torn restraints lying on the bedside table. He broke through the first pair, the doctor said without any further explanation. I guess they were just old, but better be careful. I went inside and Mr. Clark just stared at me. The skin under the restraints had turned raw from the struggle, but the wounds didn't seem to be bleeding. "Agatha," he said, letting out a strange chuckle. "You know that no one ever calls me that," I said. "Please, kill me," he then begged, his expression quickly changing from apathy to one of absolute soul-breaking fear. It only lasted for a moment before he started to laugh again. I took a step back in shock, which seemed to confuse the man. "You fear me? Why?" "Oh, you're not acting like yourself. The doctor said you're experiencing violent outbursts." "I could never hurt you, Nephilim. You granted me life," he said. "No, I don't want to be here. I'm not supposed to be alive. Please, kill me." "Nephilim? Kill me. It hurts to be here. Please," he groaned in panic. It felt as if he was arguing with himself, like two people were trapped inside his body. He didn't even sound like Mr. Clark anymore, but he knew my name. "Who are you?" He started laughing again. "We are the Acolytes, and I am just the first of so many to come through." Then he cried again, begging for death, switching between the gleeful and desperate personalities. "Thank you, Nephilim," was the last thing I heard him say. With that, he just pulled the restraints off the bed frame and sat up in bed. The doctors and nurses rushed into the room, pinning him down as they administered some kind of sedative. Even then he didn't stop, he just kept laughing. They gave him a second shot, then a third, and finally he fell limp in his bed. One of the doctors pulled me to the side, asking for me to confirm some information. Though he seemed scared, he wasn't at all surprised by Mr. Clark's bizarre behavior. "The chart says he died from complications of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Is that right?" I nodded. We did some scans, and there's no sign of any tumor mass. Apart from his obvious delusions, he's perfectly healthy." "How is that possible?" "I don't know. We'll keep him here for observation." They kept asking me questions about his prior history, how he'd acted before he got diagnosed with cancer, and how the disease had changed him. Once they realized I couldn't help them, they escorted me off the premises. Unofficially, the weird behavior was explained by hypoxia during his death, but I'm not so sure. Whatever the case, they're not letting me meet with Mr. Clark again. I'm happy he's alive, of course, but I'm not so sure it's really him anymore. I skimmed over the next few pages of the journal. They were pretty much just recounting her average day. Despite the trauma, my mother was slowly falling back into old habits. What had happened to Mr. Clark was just written off as a one-time event, so much that weeks would pass before another miraculous resurrection took place. June 2nd, 1997. It happened again. A dead man was brought back to life hours after he died. I just happened to be by his side as he drew his last breath. Oh, he was so afraid, begging for me just to hold his hands. I felt the life drain from him. I felt him fall limp as his heart stopped beating. As the doctors called the time of death, I just sat there staring at him for a while. His name was Jonathan Gates, and he'd lost his entire family in a car crash almost a decade earlier. He was alone when he got sick, and he died without any familiar faces around him. We put him in the morgue, hoping that he could finally be with his family again. Hours passed, and we started to hear knocking coming from his mortuary cooler. As we pulled him out, he just sat there and stared at us. He didn't even seem confused, nor at all affected by the hours he'd spent dead. He was just fine. It didn't make any sense. I don't understand. What had been a singular, unexplained event turned to repeated, impossible resurrections. Throughout the next months, even years, my mother went through these incredible recoveries, quickly understanding that her presence around the dead was, in fact, bringing them back. Any person she touched after their death would be brought back to life. Of course, my mother never shared that detail with anyone. Had it gotten out that she had the ability to bring people back from death, she'd have been locked up in a lab instantly. The only ones aware of her powers were herself and those she'd saved. Whether it was a gift or a curse, she didn't yet know. But seeing how her life was eventually ended by her own hands, something must have made her come to the latter conclusion. I kept reading on, hoping to finally learn what had caused my mother to finally take her own life. 8th of May, 2000. I can't leave. The acolytes won't let me. I tried so hard to stop bringing people back, but they're forcing my hand. If I don't keep working for them, they'll kill the ones I love and bring them back as their own. But the hospice care isn't enough for them anymore. I keep hearing about people dying in their homes. Not the sick, nor the elderly, but perfectly healthy people. The acolytes tell me I'm saving lives, but I know that's not the truth. The people I save, they always change. They take something back with them from the other side, entities that aren't supposed to be here. Mrs. Crawford is horrified. She's one of the few that realizes the extent of the situation. She knows something dark is coming back with the resurrected. I need to tell her the truth. I need to tell her I'm the one bringing them back. Maybe she can get Laura out of town before they take her too. But if she has the same abilities as myself, she'll never be safe. I don't know how I'll keep protecting her. I wish I could tell her the truth, but it's better for her if she just thinks I'm crazy. As long as she stays safe, it doesn't matter. I'm so sorry, Laura. I hope you can forgive me one day. And that last page awoke memories within me. I vaguely recalled Mrs. Crawford being the one to drive me out of town. She dropped me off at my grandparents' place, saying my mother had gotten sick and that I couldn't visit her for a while. Of course, I didn't understand that at the time. But as I got older, my grandparents told me it was due to mental issues. They started spewing lies about her being crazy, that she wasn't fit to care for me anymore. Whether that was part of the deal or not, I didn't know. In any case, they passed away when I was 17. They died in an unexplained house fire, taking their lives and everything they ever owned away. I was out with friends that night, coming home to find that everything was gone. As my legal guardians, there wasn't anyone forcing me to go back to my mother in Tenebris once they died. Instead, I got emancipated and started working as I lived with 3 roommates in a tiny apartment. But my mother wasn't crazy. I'd come to believe that much. And the worst thing was, I'd given up on her, never thinking to check in as I turned to an adult. She was just trying to protect me, but I still had so many questions. I turned to the next page, just as I heard the house phone ringing. I'd completely forgotten about its existence, and had just naturally assumed that the landline had been disconnected following my mother's death. "Hello, this is Laura." "Miss Florence, this is Marianne Crawford. I'm calling about our meeting tomorrow. I understand that the past 2 days must have been very tough for you, but you need to know the truth about your mother. She was not who you think she was. Please come to my office at Tenebris Care tomorrow at 9 a.m. I nodded in response, forgetting that she couldn't see me. "Miss Florence?" "Yeah, I'll be there. Thank you for calling." The conversation had felt forced and ended shortly after. Mrs. Crawford had known my mother her whole life. I was torn between skipping town and learning more about my mother. If anyone could give me the answers, I thought it would be Mrs. Crawford. I put the phone down and kept on reading. December 7th, 2015. Marianne is dead. Of all the people in the world, I thought for sure that she would outlive us all. She wasn't even sick, nor did she have any underlying conditions any of us knew of. Sure, she was in her late 60s, but she was as fit as a fiddle, just as always, resisting the burnout that affected us all. She was my best friend in this world, and my last hope of ever escaping Tenebris. But now she's gone and I'm all alone, carrying this secret with me. If I leave town now, they'll just go after Laura. I have to stay here, but that means they'll force me to bring Marion back as one of them. It's not going to be long before every single citizen of Tenebris is turned into one of the acolytes. I need to talk to Morgan. He's the only one I can trust now. Mrs. Crawford had died. I put the book down and thought back to our meeting. She was so happy to have me back in town, which should have been suspicious enough, as she'd never before been appreciative about my company. It wasn't her, that much I knew for sure. But I didn't understand why she needed me to stay in Tenebris, unless she thought I possessed the same power as my mother. Whoever I'd be meeting tomorrow, it sure wouldn't be Mrs. Crawford. Part 5. Dawson. The first thing I did after learning about Mrs. Crawford's death was attempt to call a friend back in my home city. I just needed someone to get us out of town, but, as fate would have it, no calls would go outside of town. Whoever was in control of the phone lines had made certain it only worked locally. I needed to talk to Sheriff Dawson, who'd be the one picking me up in the morning. He was his usual punctual self, showing up with a concerned look, but comforting presence. "Hear any strange sounds during the night?" he asked. "Not this time. It was pretty quiet." "I'm glad to hear it. Listen, I know things seem strange around here, but I need you to know that I wouldn't let anything happen to you." His words seemed so genuine. The concern in his eyes truly shone through his otherwise confident exterior. He was the only person in Tenebris I thought I could trust. I needed to open up and tell him what I knew. "I know about my mother," I said, checking if he'd finally come clean about the information he held. He turned pale white, holding a finger to his lips and gesturing for me to keep quiet. "What?" He walked over, a little too close for comfort. Then he leaned in towards my ear and whispered just enough to make me keep my mouth shut. "They're always listening." "Who are?" "The acolytes." He was getting visibly upset by this conversation. His calm demeanor had turned to a nervous, jumpy one. "Not here. We need to go somewhere else to talk. Do you trust me? Let's get some breakfast." I nodded. He had to be a better option than Mrs. Crawford. We followed him into the patrol car and he started driving towards the outskirts of town, where the diner was. I put a headset on Alex to make sure he wasn't listening in to our conversation. It played his favourite audiobook, giving me a moment of half privacy with Sheriff Dawson. "Can't we just leave town?" Dawson shook his head. They'd find you. Your mother tried it once, but when they threatened to bring you in, she came back. They've isolated town. No calls in nor out. No one leaves without explicit permission."
"Who are those people?"
"Oh, they ain't people, Laura. Whatever your mother brought back, it's something evil." Then a thought hit me. If everything I'd heard was true, why hadn't they converted him to whatever they were? Oh, I had too many questions, and I didn't know how to express them all in a meaningful manner. Instead, they just fell out of me like an incomprehensible alphabet soup. But Dawson, being the sheriff and all, had plenty of experience talking to people in shock.
"Why haven't they taken you?"
He paused at that, as if feeling guilty at my remark. "Sheriff?" They let me stay. They needed someone to cover for them as they brought more of their kind into our world. They're smart, and they adapt, but they're not human. Something anyone could notice if they spent enough time around them. So they use me to keep people out of town, to make sure no one falls suspicious. In the beginning, there were just a few of them. I knew they were acting strange, but not that they weren't human anymore. Oh, but now, I don't even know if there's anyone else left. Maybe Riley, I don't know. He's always been a weird case." He took a deep breath, his voice cracking ever so slightly as his previously strong facade started to fade. "I told myself I did it to protect the living, to protect you. But the truth is, I just couldn't stand the idea of one of them inside my corpse. I don't want to walk around like some sick puppet after I've died." I trusted him, mostly because he was the only bit of genuine human interaction I'd experienced in Tenebris. The rest had all been too artificial. I'd written that emotion off as nervousness, but, well, it made sense. All the people had been familiar, yet foreign. It was because they weren't themselves, but rather vessels walking around, housing creatures from another world. My mind was shattered. I still didn't fully understand what was going on in Tenebris, or why my mother had been so important to bringing people back. But one burning question still remained.
"Why me?"
"You mean you haven't figured it out yet?" Well, the question almost felt condescending. Of course the thought had struck me, but I needed absolute confirmation. "You're here to replace your mother," Sheriff Dawson said. By then, we'd already reached the diner. The lifeless exterior hardly seemed inviting, but I needed food. I'd barely eaten since arriving, save for the few snacks I brought with me. "Listen, you're going to have to pretend that you don't know what's going on. Just play dumb. We're just here to eat. If we stray away from the plan for too long, they'll get suspicious." I took the headset off Alex's head. He was still as ignorant about the horrors around him as ever, smiling at the thought of more French fries drowned in ketchup.
"You hungry, hon?"
I asked. Alex nodded enthusiastically. "Just get the meatloaf or fries. It's the only thing not rotten around here. They've kept that stuff frozen since the owners died," the sheriff whispered to me.
"They don't eat?"
I asked. "Oh, they don't have to." As before, there were no people inside, save for the waitress that didn't bother greeting us. She moved around strangely, akin to a calf learning how to walk. I hadn't noticed it last time, as she seemed fine, albeit empty inside. "You all right?" Dawson asked. The waitress ignored him, just took our orders and left with broken steps towards the back room. We ordered our food and waited in silence. I wanted to keep talking to the sheriff, but with one of them around, it wasn't safe. He kept looking over to the counter. There wasn't anyone manning it. In fact, the waitress was the only one we'd ever seen at that diner since returning to town. It only took about 10 minutes for our food to arrive. It was clearly little more than defrosted meatloaf for me and poorly cooked fries for Alex. Still, with enough ketchup, he didn't notice. I tried my best to eat it, more from hunger than actual appetite. It tasted like cardboard, which was a better alternative than rot. And then we heard it again, the sound of someone crying. It didn't take too long to realize it was the waitress. Yet, like with all the others, there wasn't a hint of emotion in the whines. "Stay here, I'll deal with this," Dawson ordered. The sheriff stood up and headed towards the back room of the diner. Alex and I remained behind, silently listening to the empty sobs. "Why is she crying?" "I don't know, Alex. Just keep eating." "Is Sheriff Morgan helping her?" he asked. "Yeah, she'll be fine. The sheriff knows exactly how to handle these things." Alex seemed satisfied by the answer. His world was so simple, as if we couldn't get hurt when we had our own police officer watching over us. Oh, I wish I could have felt that safe, but I knew that even Dawson couldn't keep the creatures from this town away from us. "Sit still, damn it. I'm just doing what they told me to," we heard Dawson yelling from the back room. I got curious, and with no one else in the diner, I figured Alex would be safe if I just got to take a peek. "Stay here, Alex. I'll be back in a second." I tried to walk quietly towards the back room where Dawson had entered. I could hear him struggle on the other side, and it had me worried. I opened the door and found him trying to pin down the waitress, holding a massive syringe in his hand. The waitress's sobs immediately turned to laughter as she saw me. A broken, wet laugh, like she had an overabundance of phlegm stuck in her throat. "It is she, Nephilim," she laughed. "She will bring the acolytes to this world. She is ours." The sheriff turned to me for a second. "Laura, what are you doing? Get out of here," he shouted before plunging the syringe into the waitress's leg. She just kept laughing. "You shan't leave. You belong to us." But then she reverted back to crying. Her eyes lit up with absolute, heartbreaking sorrow. The creature that occupied her body had vanished. "I don't want to be here. It hurts so much. I just want to go. She drifted off as the liquid Dawson had injected started to work. "What did you give her?" "Etorphin," he said as he showed me the empty syringe. "I have to give them that when they start acting weird." "What happens if you don't?" "Yeah, then the vessels break, and they show their true form." "Vessels?" "Well, the people they're using, the bodies. Now, trust me on this, you do not want to see what they really look like," he said, frustrated at my presence. He stood back up and threw the syringe onto the ground. Then he escorted me out of the room and back into the diner. Alex had already finished his meal. Dawson rushed us both into his patrol car, clearly annoyed that I'd interrupted him. "Oh, you really shouldn't have done that, Laura." "I'm sorry. I heard you yelling. I thought—" "I've been doing this for a long time. I need you to trust me if I'm going to keep you safe." The car fell silent. Alex had returned to his audiobook, still unaware just how close we were to danger. "She called me Nephilim. What's that?" The sheriff sighed. "Oh, I'm not exactly sure. Marianne and your mother were always better at these things. It basically means descendant of angels. Your mother was one, and by extension you are too. That's why your mother could bring people back from death." "Angels? Shouldn't that be a good thing?" "Well, there's another translation of the word. Some think it means fallen, but I don't know. Whatever the history behind the word is, it's a curse brought upon this town. I'm sorry your mother had to be the one bearing it, but at this point, I don't know if we can ever stop it." Defeating evil wasn't my first priority at that point. Before I did anything stupid, I needed to get Alex out of town. "Sheriff, can't you call for help?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "There has to be some other town nearby that hasn't been taken by these things. Couldn't they help?" "They die like the rest of them. And who's going to believe Tenebris has been taken over by horrific creatures from another world anyway?" he asked back. "Not that it matters. There's no way of contacting the outside world. Lines are down, and there are no working cell towers anywhere near us. Best I could do is use my radio, but even then I'd have to be miles outside of town. What about leaving Tenebris then? Leave? If I follow through on the meeting with Mrs. Crawford, could you leave? Alone? Suppose they won't care too much if they're keeping an eye on you. Then I need you to take Alex away from Tenebris. We both know it's me they want, but I need to save my son. He trusts you, and so do I. Laura, it's not... Please, if they're going to take me, I at least need to know that he's safe. Dawson sighed as he mulled over the question. All right, I'll get him out of town, but I can't protect you if I'm not here. We were about to reach the hospice again, but that time no one waited for us outside. Dawson stopped the car and I got out. Alex tried to follow me, but I stopped him. Alex, I'm going to meet with Mrs. Crawford alone. I need you to stay with Sheriff Dawson in the meantime, okay? He shook his head in refusal. I want to come with you. I know, but this time you can't. I need to speak to her in private. You trust the sheriff, right? Alex nodded. He's a good man. He'll look after you and keep you safe, I explained. But who will protect you? He asked. I couldn't help but smile at his concern, but the joy quickly faded as I realized just how right he might be. Though he didn't understand the horrors surrounding Tenebris, he knew enough to be concerned about my safety. Before I could answer, Dawson stepped forward holding a walkie in his hand. Since you lost your phone, I figured this will be a suitable replacement. At least we can keep in touch then, he said as he handed me the radio. And then he turned to Alex. You see, now she can talk to us whenever she needs to. Alex smiled, convinced that everything would work out. I'll come back as soon as I can. Be careful in there, all right? Thank you, Sheriff. Just call me Morgan. Your mother always did. I embraced Alex in a hug, trying to hold back tears. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to see him again, but I rejoiced in the fact that he'd be safe, even if it meant my own sacrifice. If these things wanted to keep me here, at least I'd go down swinging. What Dawson hadn't seen was that I took a large container of Etorphin with me, alongside a couple of syringes. Dawson drove off with Alex and I entered the hospice care, ready to learn the truth about my purpose in their world. Part 6. Replacement. Once again I stood in the cold lobby of Tenebris Care. The abstract art with the strange symbols served as the only decoration. I studied them as I waited for Mrs. Crawford to pick me up, trying to decipher their meaning. They were Hebrew, I'd figured out that much, but whatever meaning they held was lost on me. Laura, good to see you, Mrs. Crawford greeted coldly. Where's your son? I left him at home. He doesn't need to be here for our meeting. I thought you said we speak in private anyway. Naturally, however, we do have people here to help watch over children, she argued, though her worries were clearly not fueled by concern for Alex's well-being. He's being watched. Thanks for your concern. He's with Dawson, then? She asked. Look, you brought me here to talk about my mother and my purpose. How about we talk about that? She gave me an empty smile and gestured for me to follow. Together we traversed the endless corridors towards her office. That time I realized just how empty the building felt. There weren't any staff nor patients to fill the deafening silence of the facility. It was dead, and I could tell it had been like that for a long time. Without the creatures to put up a facade, there wasn't anything denying that fact. Where are the patients? I asked, almost sarcastically. I didn't expect an answer, but she still responded to my inquiry. Well, they're all alive and fine, thanks to your mother. Because she brought them back from death. She stopped in her tracks. Oh, you finally figured it out. I nodded. Good. We finally arrived at her office. I'd only seen it a single time as a kid, and I was being scolded for talking to patients in front of the visitors then. I vividly remembered the place as a cold place full of strange religious artifacts and awards for her extraordinary contributions to the town. There hadn't been any pictures of friends or family, just a singular one taken with my mother. She'd been a harsh woman in life, but she gave everything for her patients. My mother always respected that, and despite the fact that I never got along with her, she was a role model well worth looking up to. All of that was a bunch of fragmented memories because the office I stepped into on that day didn't have anything more than a desk and some papers. It was plain, depressing, and rid of the life Mrs. Crawford had once led. What it had been turned into was just another room to house the creatures that had taken over Tenebris. "Are you not afraid?" Mrs. Crawford asked. "Should I be?" She smiled again, but though her mouth was contorted into a crescent resembling joy, her eyes spoke the truth. There was not a hint of emotion behind her fake gestures, just emptiness. "Your mother had a gift, the power to bring people back from the brink of death. She quite literally held the power of life in her palms. She was a Nephilim." Now, Nephilim was a word I'd heard all too many times since arriving in Tenebris. Though I knew its most basic meaning, the true intent of the title was unknown. "What exactly is a Nephilim?" I asked. "A descendant of the first angels whose powers were transferred to their offspring. Your mother was a child of those angels, which granted her the power of life. As her daughter, you were simply an extension of that lineage. Oh, you're special, Laura." I looked at her as she spoke the words of praise. My ancestors might have been angels, but that didn't mean they were pure creatures, because even the first angels fell to earth. "What did you do to her?" "Oh, my mother. We just made her utilize her full potential. Now that she's gone, we need a replacement." She stared at me with expecting eyes. I already knew I'd be the replacement, but as long as Alex got out of town, I didn't care. "No, we already made that mistake with your mother. She never appreciated her gift. This time we need someone younger, someone that understands. Our town needs someone that can save the poor people within. As it is, everyone will die. A fact that could be prevented if only we had the right person." Her words almost sounded sincere, emphatic, but, well, they were just lies. "So you just keep me trapped here, like you did with my mother?" Her fake smile turned to an expressionless face. "Did you not learn anything about compassion during your stay here? Did I not teach you to care about those that suffer?" I didn't respond. I just stared intensely at her, hoping to get any kind of information based on her flat facade. "I was there when you were just a little girl, trying to guide you towards the truth. I tried to show you that any gift of life has to be utilized for the greater good. The problem is, Mrs. Crawford was a good woman, and you're not her." As I said that, I decided the time had come to end our conversation. Dawson and Alex had to be a safe distance away, which meant I only had one chance at escaping myself. I pulled out the syringe I'd taken from Dawson's car and plunged it into Mrs. Crawford's neck before she could even begin to react. Instinctively, she tried to pull it out, but it was too late. She just stared at me in a mixture of shock and apathy. She wasn't angry nor afraid. She let out the faintest chuckle as her body started to go limp. "I'll never help you." "You don't need to. We already have our replacement." With that, her body fell back into her chair. She was unconscious, which just about gave me enough time to flee. I exited the office, trying to seem as casual as I could, and locked it behind me. The hallways were still empty, which seemed odd. I knew I wouldn't just go along with the plan, but there was no one there to stop me. I hurried my way towards the main exit, waiting to get outside before I called Dawson over the radio. As I fled, Mrs. Crawford's last words lingered in the back of my mind. I'd expected myself as a replacement, but she wasn't talking about me. As soon as I got out of the building, I picked up the radio. "Sheriff, are you there?" Silence. "Sheriff, Alex." I was met with another moment of silence, before realizing I had to take my finger off the button. "Laura, you there?" "We're fine. Can you hear me?" Dawson asked. "I'm about to leave the hospice. Are you safe?" "Yeah, we're fine. We're a couple of miles down Glover Road, just outside of town. Managed to get hold of a few officers from Greenville. I'll meet them halfway, drop off Alex with them, and then I'll come back for you. I'll call you when I—" He was interrupted by a split-second long, loud crash before the radio fell silent. "Dawson!" I called out. No response. It sounded like they'd just crashed the car, but the possibility of it being an accident was slim to none. Still, Mrs. Crawford's last words kept ringing in the back of my mind as I futilely tried to figure out what to do. "We've already found our replacement." And then it hit me. They never wanted me to replace my mother. They wanted Alex. Part 7. Broken Facade. I stood frozen on the street looking around for any means of transportation. Dawson and Alex had lost contact somewhere on Glover Road, which meant they were in danger. There were a few abandoned cars standing by the sidewalk, but all seemed to have been untouched for about a decade. I went from car to car, looking through the window to see if any had their keys visible. The first I found was an old Honda that didn't look like it had been touched since the change of the century. Chances were it no longer ran, but since it had keys clearly visible, I had to try. With no people around, I didn't hesitate to break the window and get inside. I put the key in the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. As I suspected, it had been years since anyone had touched it. So I tried another one. Same deal. I went from car to car, trying each one that held a key, but none would start. It occurred to me that the acolytes might not need vehicles. In fact, I hadn't seen anyone using cars apart from Riley and Dawson. As those thoughts ran through my head, I saw Riley pull up at the hospice. He looked worried, rushing towards the door without even noticing all the smashed glass on the street. His car would be the best chance I had to escape, but I needed his keys first. "Riley," I called out as I ran towards him. He seemed genuinely surprised to see me, mixed with a hint of guilt. "Laura, what are you doing here?" "I took care of Mrs. Crawford." "What?" He looked almost afraid, worried that I might lunge at him. With him distracted by surprise, I took the chance at overpowering him. I pulled out the second syringe I'd stolen and held it firmly against his neck. "Laura, what are you doing?" "I need your car keys." All right. Just don't kill me, please." "Don't pretend like this would kill you. I'm not letting you take my son, you piece of shit." No, wait, I'm not one of them. Please, I don't want to die." I hesitated. He seemed absolutely terrified, so full of real emotion, unlike anything I'd seen emerge from the acolytes. "You brought us here. If you're not one of them, then why the fuck are you helping them?" He was shaking. "You don't know what they're capable of. But they have my daughter. They made me help them. Please don't kill me. If I'm gone, they'll kill her." For a moment, I actually felt sorry for the man, but the fact still remained that he'd aided them in kidnapping my own son. So while I wasn't going to hurt him, I could still use him to get where I needed to go. "Right, get in the car. You're driving." "Just take my keys and let me go," he said as he pulled them out from his pocket. "No, I can't let you warn them." I pushed the needle closer to his skin, puncturing it but not injecting the fluid. He obliged and got into the driver's seat. "Right, get me to Glover Road." We started driving, fast. On the empty roads, it hardly mattered if we kept to the speed limit. Riley was sweating bullets, his hands shaking as he gripped onto the steering wheel for dear life. Your daughter. What's her name? I asked. Amanda, Riley stuttered. Do you know where she is? Basement of the hospice care. That's where they keep all the children and broken vessels. Why? I don't know. Please, Laura, these things, they're not human. You don't know what you're dealing with. I ignored his pleas. It didn't matter how dangerous they were. I wouldn't let them take Alex. How did you even get involved with them? I was just traveling through town. Someone said they needed a lawyer and that I could help the aging population of the town. I took my kid with me on a weekend trip to do some business. But they took her. They took Amanda. Well, I couldn't help but sympathize with Riley. But whatever compassion my heart held for him, it had been tainted with hatred for bringing us here. His willingness to sacrifice myself and Alex, even if it was for his own daughter, could not be forgiven. We'll get her back, I said, trying to sound compassionate, but coming across as annoyed. He almost seemed to relax at the statement, as if his fear had broken to be replaced with trust. We kept driving out of town, only passing by the occasional acolyte staring us down as we drove by. They didn't try to stop us, whether it was because they couldn't or they didn't need to. Neither of us knew, but the fact alone sent shivers down my spine. Before long we arrived at Glover Road, the only stretch of concrete that led away from Tenebris. It stretched on for 100 miles before reaching the main road. There were a few small towns along the way, but even they were about 60 miles out. Where are they exactly? Riley asked. But I didn't have to answer, because a pillar of smoke was emerging from just beyond the horizon. I knew it was the car, a suspicion that would be immediately confirmed as we found the still burning wreckage of Dawson's flipped-over patrol car. The sheriff himself lay on the side, covered in blood and not moving, and Alex was nowhere in sight. "Stop the car!" I yelled. Riley hit the brakes, and I basically dove out, rushing over towards the wreck. "Sheriff!" I called out, but he remained unresponsive. I took a brief moment to look through the wreckage, just checking if Alex had been trapped inside. It was empty. Whoever had caused the accident had done it with the intention of taking Alex away, and they'd succeeded. "Is he?" Riley asked as he pointed to Dawson. His body was broken, covered in gashes and bruised flesh from the impact. I bent down carefully, afraid to confirm his death. "Morgan?" I said meekly as I gently shook him. Then he opened his eyes and gasped for air, trying to get up in panic as adrenaline surged through his body. "He's breathing," I exclaimed in relief. After a couple of seconds of observing his surroundings, he finally tried to talk. "Oh, where am I?" he groaned. "Glover Road. You were in an accident," I said. He looked at me, studying me as if he couldn't recognize me. His head had a large gash on the side, still actively bleeding. "Laura?" "Yeah, it's me. What happened to you? Where's Alex?" "I don't know." Apart from the lacerations and bruises, he didn't seem to have any broken bones. It was almost a miracle considering how mangled the car was. Once he'd regained his senses, I helped Dawson to his feet and brought him back to Riley's car. "John," Dawson said as he noticed Riley's presence. "You brought her to me?" "I just wanted to help, Sheriff." "Did you manage to call for help?" I asked Dawson. He looked at me, confused without the faintest idea what I was talking about. He just rubbed his head. I don't know." Even if help was on the way, it would take hours for them to cross the rough roads from even the nearest city. It'd be time we didn't have, so we got in the car and started driving back towards Tenebris. "Riley, you said they'd take the children to the basement." "Yeah, but I don't know if that's where they took your son." I turned to Dawson, who was sitting motionless in his seat, just observing the world outside the window. He was still in a haze from the crash, unable to contribute much to the discussion. "Sheriff, what do you think?" "There were no children." "What?" He didn't respond. We continued the drive in silence. A million thoughts and ideas ran through my mind, but all of them would either result in our death or inevitable capture by the acolytes. We needed a way to kill them, or at least slow them down, but they weren't human. Then my eyes got distracted by the syringe lying on the dashboard, full of etorphin, enough for just one of the monsters in Tenebris. "Sheriff, do you have more of the sedatives?" He gave me a peculiar look. "Etorphin, where do you keep it?" I clarified. He mulled it over a bit, trying to remember where he'd acquired the little stash he kept in his car. "Oh, sorry. My head's not all there yet. The drugs are at the station." "Then that's where we need to go. If we're going to save Alex and your daughter, we need something to defend us with." "It won't help," Dawson interjected. "What do you mean?" "They're too strong. Whatever you try to do, they will win." He looked at me as he awaited my response. Something was wrong with him. He'd never shown signs of defeat like that before. "I don't care. I'm going to save my son even if it kills me." As we returned to town, the emptiness struck me again. By then it would have been impossible for the acolytes not to know what we were up to, and yet they were nowhere in sight. No one had tried to stop us, and not a single creature had come to even check up on us. "Where is everyone?" I asked. "They already have what they need. You don't matter to them anymore," Dawson said. We pulled up to the sheriff's department parking lot and got out. There were a couple of other patrol cars there, both unused for years, covered in dried-out leaves and dust. The building didn't fare much better, serving as little more than a reminder of what had once stood there. The inside was just as barren, the desks covered in dust, and the papers left behind ancient. It was clear that the department had been shut down years earlier, both by the layer of dirt and the outdated technology left behind. How Dawson had kept up appearances for so long I couldn't fathom, but I had to assume that not many outsiders ever came to visit the station. "I'm going to wait outside. Keep the car running and all," Riley said nervously. Dawson didn't even acknowledge him. He just led me into the back room, which was a combination of a storage space and an evidence locker. He took out a box of medical supplies and left the room. "Sheriff?" "Stay here. I need to prepare the solution." I remained behind, looking over the hundreds of untouched files and boxes. On each of them, someone had written a case number and the name of the person involved. I read over each case, realizing I could recognize many of the names. Most were probably trivial, unimportant police reports, but one stood out from the rest. Case file number 00109. Agatha Florence, it read. I looked behind me, making sure Dawson was out of sight, before pulling out the box and investigating its contents. Within lay a single file and a couple of tape recordings. I scanned the room for a playback device. It only had the one, an ancient player covered in dust, but it still worked, producing an oddly nostalgic whirring sound as I turned it on. I put the tape in and clicked play. At first I was only met by static. The roll of tape turned, pulling an audio recording that was more than 20 years old. Then, after a few moments of dead air, a voice came through. 7th of December 1998. This is an interview with Agatha Florence regarding a patient missing from Tenebris care. It was Dawson's voice, from an interview with my mother. "Mrs. Florence, could you tell me exactly what happened?" "Mrs. Florence, really? Oh, come on, Morgan, we're friends. You don't have to act all professional just because you're the sheriff." He sighed. "All right, Aggie. What exactly happened?" She paused for a moment. "Do we really have to record this?" "Yeah, I'm sorry, but it's protocol. Everything needs to be documented." "Fine." "So, tell me, who went missing?" "Jonathan Henderson. He wasn't in his bed yesterday. It's not abnormal for patients suffering from dementia to try and leave, but, well, he's one of the patients that came back from death." He's one of the, resurrected. Yeah, they've all been acting strange. They don't seem like themselves. I mean, it's not like they're sick anymore, nor do they have any neurological damage. We usually send them home, but Mr. Henderson was different. He was talking to himself, crying during the night. It scared the other patients, so we were going to have him transferred. When was he supposed to be transferred? Oh, the day after he vanished. At first we thought someone had initiated the transfer early, but there was no documentation regarding any pickup. So, you think he left without being noticed, on his own? No. I think he was taken. By who? I don't know. How many resurrections have you seen at Tenebris Care so far? 23. And you have no idea what causes them? Well, she hesitated. No, I don't know. The interview was replaced by static, and the tape ended. I picked up the paper, which described the same case in detail, including the events that led to Mr. Henderson's death, and his miraculous resurrection. But something else was written there, a story I remembered myself, because I took part in it. 4th of January 1999. Sheriff Morgan Dawson was called into Tenebris Care alongside Officer Tyler Jenkins due to alleged assault taking place in the basement of Tenebris Care. The first victim was a 39-year-old woman by the name of Agatha Florence, who suffered a laceration to her right temple. The second victim was a 6-year-old girl by the name of Laura Florence, who sustained a fractured radius. The assailant was described as 78-year-old Jonathan Henderson, who had been missing prior to the incident since the 7th of December 1998. He hasn't been seen since the alleged assault. That was the nightmare that had been haunting me for the past months. The memory I'd been told was a lie, but now I had proof. Then I put the second tape recording in and started listening. 6th of January 1999. Interview with the victim of assault taking place on the 4th of January. Agatha Florence, Dawson said. Aggie, you don't have to do this if you're not up for it. I need to. I saw him. It was Mr. Henderson, but it wasn't him. What do you mean? Somebody was using his body. He couldn't resist, but... Aggie, you're not making any sense. Before I could keep listening to the conversation, I was interrupted by Dawson returning to the evidence locker. I jumped as he suddenly stood behind me. You're not supposed to be going through these files. Oh, Sheriff, sorry. You scared me. What are you doing? I'm just trying to figure out about my mother. She might have the answers we need to stop these things. Agatha was a talented woman, but she never figured out how to stop them. How do you know that? The words froze in my throat as I realized just what was going on. You never called her that. You always called her Aggie. He didn't respond. He just stood there and stared at me expectantly. Where are the sedatives? I asked, knowing exactly what he'd done. We're not going to need those. I slowly started backing away from Dawson, knowing full well I had nowhere to run. I still had one syringe full of etorphin in my pockets, but I knew he'd be ready for it. Riley, I called out. He can't hear you. What did you do? What happened to Morgan? The poor man broke his neck on impact, but it didn't stop the pain he experienced as his body stopped working. But that was not what truly broke him. What hurt the most was the guilt he felt for allowing you to enter Tenebris. One touch of your hand was all I needed to enter his body from the realm of Orali. He pointed to his neck and pushed it to reveal how unhinged it had truly gotten following the crash. He's gone. Parts of him still linger, but not for long. He took a step closer, at which point I had no choice but to pull out the syringe. I tried to hit his jugular, but Dawson was too fast. He grabbed my arm and pushed it against the wall. The sedative got knocked onto the floor, and he started pulling me towards the exit. Once we got to the door, I could see 2 more acolytes holding on to Riley by the car, as a third one stood in front of him. "Please, I did everything you asked me to do," he pleaded. But they didn't respond. They just stared at him with their empty eyes. "You promised to give my daughter back. I did what you wanted. Please, just let us go." "You did exactly what we needed," one of them said. "You've served your purpose." And with that, the skin on the acolyte's arm started cracking, allowing dark flesh to ooze out, forming an obsidian black mesh of meat on the outside. Pieces of human muscle, fat and skin started dropping, creating sickly squishes as they hit the ground. The black appendage that had been formed was covered in white vein-like structures, with rough bone covering them. "Oh, please. Oh, God, no," Riley yelled. But his helpless pleas brought him nothing. The acolyte shoved its limb into Riley's abdomen, allowing the dark meat to enter his cavities, tearing him apart from the inside. He screamed in a mixture of horror and agony as his internal organs were shredded to pieces. There was nothing he could do. His body was ruined beyond repair, but he still remained conscious. For a minute, the acolyte just held him upright, waiting for Riley to finally stop breathing. Once the life had finally left his eyes, he was tossed onto the ground. I couldn't even scream. I just stood there and stared at Riley's corpse. Dawson let go of my arm, and I just collapsed to the ground in shock. The acolyte that had killed him started falling apart. Chunks of his facade fell off, revealing a dark figure underneath, covered in exposed, rotten muscle. That was their true form, and now they had everything they wanted. They could finally shed their human vessels. Dawson stood above me, expecting me to fight back, but it would have been a futile task. "It's time for you to come with us," he said. "You still have a chance to live." Part 8. The Basement. Dawson gestured for the other acolytes to come inside, ready to take me away for the last time. As astronomically small as my chances were, I had to take action. I dove for the last syringe still resting on the floor, grabbed it, and slammed it into Dawson's leg with absolute precision. He let out a brief groan of anger and grabbed onto me. "Fighting back will not save your son." But the injection had already begun to work, and Dawson was quickly losing control of his captured body. As he fell to his knees, I rushed to barricade the front door, just in time to block the other acolytes out. It wouldn't slow them down too much, but it'd buy me enough time to stock up on whatever weapons they still kept inside the armory. It was situated directly next to the evidence room, only accessible with a key struck to Dawson's keychain. Once he'd finally lost consciousness, I took off his belt and rushed to pile up on weapons. They didn't have much more than a few shotguns and about a dozen pistols, but it would have to suffice. Even with my limited knowledge in firearms, I knew enough to pull the trigger and reload, a lesson learned through hunting with my grandfather. I loaded the shotgun first, and returned to the entrance hall where the acolytes were halfway through my barricade. Dawson lay in front of them, unconscious on the ground. I wanted to fire a slug into his head, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy his body, still not sure whether it would kill the acolyte inside. Instead, I aimed for the ones breaking through the door. The first shot hit one square in the head. It fell backwards onto the street outside, still wriggling as it tried to regain its senses. Still, the second one managed to break through. I shot him in the middle of his torso. Well, it hardly seemed to slow him down, but it allowed me to get off another shot, which hit him in the head. There didn't seem to be any organs beneath their flesh, only solid black matter holding on to a viscous, murky fluid. While the acolytes tried to get back on their feet, I made a run for Riley's car. His corpse still lay on the ground in front of it, but I didn't dare move it away, in fear that I might bring other acolytes into our world. As I drove away, I saw the mangled remains of the acolyte crawl over to Riley's body. It started consuming his flesh in an attempt at rebuilding itself. Chunks of the corpse's flesh turned dark, and the acolyte just put it on himself. Oh, they truly were parasites, unable to sustain their own lives without human hosts. My destination was still Tenebra's Care, the place where it had all started, and where it might, hopefully, end. The street still remained empty, even outside of the hospice care. I parked the car on the side of the road and sprinted inside with the shotgun in hand, but immediately I halted as I found Mrs. Crawford inside. "Laura, you're making a mistake." I pointed the shotgun at her face, but she didn't even flinch at the notion. "Where's Alex?" "In the basement," she stated matter-of-factly. "He's being prepared." "For what?" "He's a very special boy. More so than both yourself and your mother." I took a step closer, getting in range for a perfect headshot. "You're not using him. I'm gonna fucking stop you." "Why?" "Think, Laura. Imagine what this broken world could become if the acolytes were in control. This place was never meant for you. Your species is but a pest that has brought nothing but destruction along its path. As opposed to you? We need to rid the world of this plague first. Sometimes you need to burn a place down before you can rebuild." I'd had enough of her distractions. "I'm going to the basement, and you're not stopping me," I tried to say as confidently as possible. "Why would I stop you?" Then I heard the door open behind me. I spun around and pointed the weapon at the intruder. They just stood there, not even attempting to stop me. "Go ahead," Mrs. Crawford said. "Go to your son." It was a trap, I knew that much, but even if going to the basement would kill me, it'd be worth it if it gave Alex even the faintest chance at life. I started running, briefly checking behind me to see if the acolytes were giving chase, but they just watched me flee. I ran and didn't stop until I reached the heavy metal doors guarding the basement. It was silent on the other side, not even a whisper to fill the empty air. I opened the doors and pulled out my flashlight. The place hadn't changed in the slightest since the last time I'd set foot inside. I took a deep breath and locked the basement door behind me, plunging me into blinding darkness. Even with the flashlight, my surroundings remained obscured, as if the surfaces flat out rejected the light. As I descended the staircase, the air turned thick, and I could hear the sound of setting metal, as if something was twisting around inside the pipes. The hallway itself remained the same, long concrete walls lined with doors on each side, rid of any source of light. As a child, I'd been much shorter, giving the illusion of a large space, when in reality it was quite narrow. I hadn't even noticed the fact that each door was decorated with small windows, too high up for a child to reach. Any of them could have contained Alex, but Riley's daughter still remained another priority. If she really was there, I couldn't let her die alone, not after the promise I'd given Riley. I took a look through the first window, which revealed little more than an empty room. Then I moved on to the second. There I found an old man chained to a bed. His lower extremities were fused with a dark mesh that stretched towards the back wall, pulsating as it seemed to feed off him. The man was clearly still alive, breathing, but luckily not conscious. I gave the handle a try, but the door was locked in place. I couldn't help it. But I couldn't linger either. I had to move on. The next room held a pile of the same dark flesh. The only resemblance of a human being I could find was an eye and a patch of skin still visible. The dark flesh looked similar to what I'd seen on the acolytes, but it carried no humanoid features, just an amorphous, disgusting blob. Each and every room carried a similar view, until I got about halfway through. I shone my light through the door to find a young girl sitting against one of the walls, looking absolutely horrified. She jumped to her feet as soon as she noticed my light, and ran over to the window. She screamed something unintelligible. The sound stopped by the thick glass in the door. "Help me," she mouthed. Then I noticed the wall she'd been staring at. It was covered in flesh, just like the mass that had been consuming the other people in the cells. The girl had to be Amanda, and she couldn't have been older than 12. The flesh on the wall was pulsating, with small tendrils reaching out for her. It seemed to be growing, and it wanted to catch her. Still, I had no means with which to open the door. "I'm sorry. I'll come back for you," I tried to say as clearly as possible. No sound could get through the door, but I prayed that she understood me. And then I just left her, and I could hear the vague sound of her banging on the door. I redirected my flashlight towards the end of the long hallway, when I realized something. There was a source of light, other than my own, coming from the very last room. A faint glimmer of hope lit up inside me, and I could almost feel Alex's presence there. Ignoring the rest of the rooms, I just rushed towards the end, my heart filling with an inexplicable feeling of joy, drowning out the overwhelming dread of the place. Once there, I pressed my face up against the glass, finally getting a glimpse of the inside. What I was faced with stood in stark contrast to the rest of the rooms. It was neatly decorated with colourful walls and happy pictures, filled with toys and furniture that truly rung in a cosy feel. It was a children's room, and in the middle of it sat Alex. He was playing with some building blocks, surrounded by a circle of empty chairs that all faced him. As he tossed around the blocks, he'd intermittently lift his head as if talking to invisible guests sitting on the chairs. "Alex!" I shouted, but he couldn't hear me. Then, just by chance, he lifted his head in my direction and saw me frantically screaming on the other side. But despite the long-awaited reunion, he didn't smile at my presence. In fact, he almost looked afraid. He turned his head back at one of the chairs and shook his head in disapproval as a panicked expression washed over his face. What he thought he was seeing, I don't know, but it wasn't anything good. He glanced over at me for one last time, before forcing his head down and continuing to play. "You see, he's happy here," a voice said from behind me. I turned around to see Mrs. Crawford standing there. As I'd been calling out for Alex, I hadn't noticed her sneaking up on me. "Alex has a greater purpose than what you could ever dream of. With us, he will achieve great things. Truly magnificent events will occur, all thanks to your son." "You stay the fuck away from me," I said as I lifted the shotgun. "Do you think that will stop me?" I knew it wouldn't. Even if it slowed her down, I wasn't leaving Tenebris without Alex. A couple of acolytes came down the hall, both of them having shed their human forms. That was the first time I got to see their faces. They were just empty bricks of flesh, dark with hollow sockets rid of any eyes. Their mouths were constantly hanging open, but contained no tongue nor any recognizable piece of anatomy, save spikes that hardly resembled teeth. Due to the gaping holes in their necks, there was no way they could produce human speech, which was presumably why they chose to maintain their human form. "Laura, it's time to give up." I kept alternating my aim between them all, but they hardly cared. "Why did you let me come down here at all?" "So you could see what would happen, to Alex and to yourself." I dropped the shotgun, finally being hit by the undeniable defeat I'd led myself into. I turned to Alex, watching him one last time through the glass. "Who is he even talking to?" I asked. "The fact that you cannot see that is the reason why we do not need you anymore." I didn't respond. There wasn't any point. "You've been so determined to stop us, but now it's time for you to see where we came from, and why we will never go back there." With that, the two acolytes grabbed onto my arms and started dragging me away from Alex. I didn't resist. I just let a few tears roll down as I realized I'd never see him again. All we wished for was a place to live. Our world, the domain we came from, was created for suffering. It was a punishment for wanting freedom. Without your lineage, we would have been stuck there forever, left behind in misery for the rest of eternity. You could have helped us out, but you refused. So, I should just let you take their bodies? They were already dead. What difference does it make what happens to them? She argued. If that were true, why didn't you just ask for help? We wanted to give you time, to let the idea sink in before we overwhelmed you with all this information. You were not ready, Laura. But your son, Alex, will accept his fate. I looked her in the eyes, trying to find any semblance of a human being within her emotionless facade. They killed Riley, Dawson, and countless others, a fact they couldn't deny. Are you going to kill me now, like you did with my mother? Your mother's life ended by her own hands. No, she never wanted this. She killed herself to stop you. And look where that brought us. She paused. We will not kill you, but you will see exactly where we came from. Then you will finally understand. And with that ominous threat, they opened the only windowless door in the entire basement and brought me inside. It was a storage room full of medical supplies, disinfectant, medications, and bandages. All stuff they'd locked away after they found me building makeshift torches from the medical paraffin when I was a child. Now they were just useless remnants for time long since past. In the back, the walls were covered in the same growing flesh that was consuming the other prisoners. What the hell is that? I asked, fear surging through my body as I realized just how close my end was. Soon, it will be you. Then they threw me against the flesh. My skin immediately started to fuse with it, burning as the dark meat started to cover my back, digging its way further into my body. I could feel it squeeze its way through my ribs, constricting around my lungs. I tried to scream, but I couldn't catch a breath deep enough to produce any audible sounds. I wriggled around in agony, but it had already wrapped itself around me, making it impossible to move. Then I felt tendrils wrap around my heart, squeezing it until it finally stopped beating. That was the moment my body died. But I still remained conscious for long enough to see Mrs. Crawford smiling at my demise, the first real emotion she'd ever produced. I wish things had been different, Laura, but you made this happen. The world around me faded away, and I started falling, far through an infinite void of darkness, an abyss so far away from life that I feared I might never get back. Still, death was not the friend to greet me on the other side, because the flesh would never let me perish. It would keep me alive like some twisted life support system, using my body to bring back more of the acolytes. My mind would be the only thing to leave, to be sent far away to the realm of Irali, the home of the acolytes. Part 9. The Realm of Irali. The Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia had their own concept of the underworld. Rather than fiery pits and endless torture, they believed in a world that closely resembled our own, a twisted copy, rid of all the joys that exist in real life, a mere shadow of what used to be. There they are destined to live out the rest of eternity, until their minds are broken down shells of their former selves. This hell, known as Irkala or Irali, existed parallel to the real world, with its inhabitants unable to escape for the rest of time. The acolytes had just thrown me into a mesh of meat, one that had taken over my body and thrown me away from life itself. Still, I hadn't died. I was just trapped in the dark dimension, out of reach to help Alex. Once I'd fallen all the way through the darkness, I felt the acolyte's grip loosen around me. With that realization, the darkness gave way to light, and I fell hard onto the ground of the storage room. The flesh that had tried to consume me only moments before had vanished into thin air, and I was left alone in the dark, fumbling around for any source of light. I dug my mother's old lighter out from my pocket, and used its dim light to guide my way. And to the best of my knowledge, I was still in the hospice care, but the atmosphere felt all too foreign, as if I'd travelled 1,000 miles away. Once the initial shock had faded, I realized that I still couldn't breathe. Despite being freed, I could still feel the flesh constrict around my dead heart and broken lungs. Still, my body just refused to die. I tried to call out for help, but without air in my body, I couldn't produce a single sound. I stumbled into the hallway, listening intently to my surroundings. But it was dead silent, as if the place had been abandoned in the short span I was unconscious. I decided to check out Alex's room, which was as empty as the rest of the hallway. All that had been left behind were dried out, broken furniture and a few dusty toys. It looked like the place had been abandoned for years. Just sat there in disbelief, not fully understanding what was going on, nor what had happened to me. I sobbed silently, tears rolling down my cheeks without producing an audible cry. Then I went on to check the other rooms, but they were all gone. The poor people kept in the basement, Riley's daughter, Alex, everything. The world was empty, and I had been alone to suffer in a broken body. With no other options left, I decided to leave the basement, not caring if the acolytes found me, not worrying about capture. In a way, I felt anhedonic, like the world was stealing my emotions. The only thing that kept me going was the ever-fading hope that Alex still might have a chance. The rest of Tenebra's care didn't fare much better. The entire facility was covered in dust, dirt and debris, forgotten by time itself. What had once been the last station of life had now been the beginning of something else, something dark and unexplained. I walked around the hallways, heading aimlessly for the exits. Where I planned to go, I didn't know, nor did I have any fighting spirit left to resist whatever horrors awaited me outside. But despite being helpless, there was nothing left to stop me. On the outside, the streets looked the same, albeit more run down and dirty. The buildings were still there, though on the brink of collapse. Then I saw another person walking down the road. It was a sickly, emaciated, naked figure I couldn't recognize. Their ribs protruded prominently from their chest, and their arms hung limp to their side. They didn't even seem to notice my presence. They just slowly wandered by, not giving me a single thought. I went over to check if they needed help, but they kept ignoring my presence even as I attempted to shake them. The world I had entered was all too familiar, and yet I knew it wasn't the same. I had been tossed into the realm of the acolytes, a prison meant for the fallen angels of a bygone era. But now they were mostly freed, brought to our world by my mother, by myself and Alex. I started heading for the police station. Didn't have a particular purpose in mind, apart from checking if the tapes were still there, if I could find any source of help. It wasn't even far, but each step I took felt warped, as if an eternity passed for each passing foot. Then I saw the station, looking just as run down as I'd left it. Riley's corpse was still there, lying in the same spot he'd died. The hole in his abdomen was ever present, and his cavity had been hollowed out where the acolyte had dug around. I walked over, intending to finally bury his body, but then I noticed something that stopped me dead in my tracks. He was still alive. His eyes moved in my direction, and he looked up at me. "Laura," he groaned quietly in agony. I couldn't respond to him. My lungs still wouldn't function. Instead, I just put a hand on his shoulder in a hopeless attempt at comforting him. "What's happening to me? Why am I not dead? Why can't I move?" His spine had been snapped in half by the acolyte, and he had indeed died. The world we'd both entered didn't grant us new bodies. It just brought our consciousness with it, forcing us to experience the exact same suffering that had killed us. But I wasn't like him. My body was still alive, albeit trapped in another dimension. "Did they get to you too?" he asked. I nodded. "It's been so long since I last saw you. I hoped you'd gotten away." Every scrape on his body had accompanied him to the afterlife, and there was nothing I could do to help him. "My daughter, "Did you find her?" Riley asked. Again, I just nodded. Is she alive?" I smiled reassuringly. I wanted so desperately to talk to him, to let him know she was unharmed. It would be a partial lie because, though she hadn't yet died, there was no one there left to save her. That's good. I hope she gets out. I hope they don't hurt her." And with that confirmation, Riley just started staring in front of himself, as if he no longer realized I was by his side. His body wasn't gone, but his mind no longer needed to be there. He'd learned what he needed, that his daughter hadn't suffered the same horrible fate as himself. For a while I just sat by his side, waiting to see if he'd regain lucidity, but he never did. Like the emaciated figure I'd met earlier, he was far too far gone to even function. Hours passed, feeling twisted and wrong before I decided to keep moving. I entered the abandoned sheriff's department, only to find everything gone. What was left behind was little more than broken furniture and dirt that used to be papers. It had become apparent that time moved differently in this dimension, which meant that everything I needed was already gone. Defeated, and without an ounce of hope, I started heading for my childhood home. I didn't have a goal in mind, I just wanted some semblance of familiarity, a place I could wait out until time destroyed me like it had Riley, a place I could finally give up. On the way I saw more emaciated figures. They were all heading in the same direction out of town. It dawned on me that these were the lucky ones, the people who died with enough function to move around. I could only guess how many poor souls were stuck somewhere else, unable to move, incapable of understanding what was going on around them, trapped within their own bodies for all of eternity. I wondered how long it would take before my mind would give in to the idea, before I faded away like the others. Then I thought about where they were heading to. If it was anything more than the mere human instinct to keep going, even with no destination in mind. Their bodies wouldn't let them just give up, taken over by autopilot in a last-ditch attempt at survival. But among the crowd I noticed a tall figure tower above them. It was an acolyte, slowly moving among them, observing them. It went from person to person before finally reaching its hand out towards one of them. It penetrated his chest and slammed him to the ground. There it started converting the human flesh to its own, patching itself up as it did. I ducked out of sight, watching the acolyte from afar. It seemed to need the other people to sustain itself, but it was so much slower than the ones I'd seen back in the real world. The place I'd been trapped in wasn't just hell for us, but for them as well. Once the acolyte had finished consuming the poor man, it kept moving, walking in the same direction as the others. I walked on, intent on reaching my childhood home, but for each step I took, I felt the emotion drain from me. My worry about Alex, my shame for being captured, it was all fading, replaced slowly by unrelenting anhedonia. Then I arrived at my mother's old house. It seemed almost untouched, as broken down as the last time I'd set foot inside, but still the same. Somehow it felt more lived in than the rest of the horrific world around me. I opened the old door, almost comforted by the familiar creaks it produced. It wasn't as dusty as I'd expected. In fact, it seemed cleaner than the house I'd spent the last couple of days in. I entered the kitchen, where I found the first piece of intact furniture, just a wooden table and a couple of chairs. "Laura," I heard a voice say from behind me. It was my mother, 20 years older than the last time I'd seen her, but just as human. Her hair had grayed and her skin had formed wrinkles from a lifetime of stress. I just stood there, frozen from the shock of seeing the woman who'd abandoned me so many years ago. Even though I knew that she only meant to protect me, the resentment lingered without logical reasoning. I tried to speak up, temporarily forgetting that my lungs weren't working. "Don't try to talk. You're not going to be able to. Just sit down because I need to tell you something." She sounded nervous and her speech felt rehearsed. Well, I wasn't sure how long she'd been waiting there, but it felt as if she'd been expecting me for quite some time. Still, I obliged and sat down by the kitchen table. I glanced at her arms, noticing deep gashes on her wrists that had been slit when she committed suicide. I pointed to them, hoping she'd understand what I was trying to ask. "Don't worry, it doesn't hurt anymore." Then I pointed to my own heart, in an attempt at asking her if I'd died, or if I was trapped in some other kind of nightmare. "You're not dead. They'd never kill you, but your body is trapped in a dormant state, forcing your mind here." She looked at me for a moment, just inspecting me. "Oh, you're so beautiful, you know that. You can't imagine how proud I am of you. I'm so unbelievably sorry that I couldn't be with you as you grew up. I hope you know that I only meant to protect you, but even through my efforts, I could only keep you safe for so long." Tears were forming in my eyes, both from frustration at not being able to talk and from being overwhelmed by seeing my mother for the first time since I was a child. I knew in my broken heart that she was dead, but it didn't diminish the experience in the slightest. "Laura, we don't have much time, so you need to focus." She just stared at me until I finally nodded in agreement. "You've fused with their flesh, which means it's a part of you. It's inside your body, but you can control it if you focus. The more time you spend here, the more you'll fuse with the flesh of the acolytes, until there's nothing left but unrecognizable pieces of you inside. Laura, you need to go back to the hospice. You need to be as close to the flesh as possible when you return." I looked at her in disbelief, too afraid of the oncoming fight. Even if I could return and free myself from the flesh, I didn't have the faintest clue on how to escape, nor did I want to leave my mother behind. Seeing her for the first time in so long, only to leave her hours later, was a heartbreaking task. I pointed at her, trying to get her to come with me. "I can't, Laura. My body's already gone and my spirit's fading. The only reason I've held on for so long is because I was afraid you'd end up here by my side. Now that I finally see you again, there's no doubt in my heart that you'll make it out of Tenebris alive, but you have to leave as soon as possible." I nodded half-heartedly in agreement, and we both stood up. That was the first time I saw how frail my mother had truly become, a very different image compared to the woman I'd known as a child. Each step she took was a struggle, and though she wouldn't admit it, I could tell her slit wrist still hurt. She led me to the door and it opened up. I was ready to leave, but first I just embraced her in a hug. Her arms around me was the first thing to make me feel truly safe in the past 20 years, a feeling I had long since forgotten existed. "I love you, Laura. I wish things had been different." I had so many questions to ask: who my father was, how he ended with these curses as Nephilims, but I couldn't form the words to ask. But though I couldn't utter a single word, the look on my face said enough. I know, but now it's time to go. Say hello to my grandson for me. Tell him I'll always be watching over him." And with those parting words, she closed the door behind me, and I started walking back towards Tenebris care. When I glanced back at the house, it seemed all too empty. A light had been extinguished, one that belonged to my mother's soul. On my way back, I passed several more of the empty people, all of them heading out of town into the wilderness beyond Tenebris. Whether they'd find peace there or if they'd simply wandered on forever, I didn't know. Tenebris care had always been a place for death, but after my mother's curse came to life, it had been hailed as a place for life. To me, it was both, and once I returned, I still didn't know exactly how to escape the oncoming storm of death. The basement door still stood open, untouched since I'd exited. I hesitated as I stood before it, peeking into the darkness below. I was worried, not for my own safety, but that I might fail again, to doom Alex to an imprisoned life, to be used as a puppet by the acolytes. I held my mother's Zippo lighter in front of me, and made my way back to the storage room. Once there, I placed myself in the middle and started focusing. As my mother had said, I just let my body feel all the pain I'd been repressing, and before long I felt the flesh move inside my chest. I felt the holes in my back, the constriction around my heart. The more I let the pain sink in, the more I felt myself awakening once more. Then I felt my arms pinned down, my body trapped. I couldn't move anymore. I could just barely wriggle myself around. I closed my eyes tightly, and once I opened them again, I was back in the real world, with my body fused to the flesh of the acolytes. It was inside my body, forcing its way around each and every one of my organs. But I could control them, just weakly at first, silence them for a second or two at a time. But as time went on, my influence over them got stronger. I could feel it slip away, slithering away just enough for me to control my arms. While I couldn't rip myself from the wall, I could fumble around in my pockets. I pulled out my mother's lighter, not exactly sure how I'd escaped my torture. Then my eyes drifted towards the isopropyl alcohol and all the things that had been moved into the abandoned storage. I wriggled my foot around, just enough to knock over one of the containers, causing alcohol to spill out all over the floor. Then, as the tendrils started to gain control again, digging back into my flesh, I let go of the lit lighter. It wasn't a well-thought-out plan, but in the immense amount of agony that I was feeling, I really didn't have any other choice. The fire ignited the alcohol and started climbing the flesh within seconds. I just prayed that it would let go before I burned to death. I didn't have to wait long, because no sooner had the fire eaten the bottom of the flesh before it started retracting into the wall, escaping the oncoming heat. I fell to the ground, knocking the air out of me as I did. I lay there for a second, almost suffocating from the smoke filling the room. I was freed, but I only had minutes to escape before the rest of the containers caught fire, which would inevitably blow up the entire basement. Part 10. What We Leave Behind. The flesh stood ablaze, producing a high-pitched screech as the fire spread. Pieces of it reached out, desperately trying to grab onto me, but I was too far out of reach. I just stared at the dying monstrosity, glad to finally breathe again. But I had lit a fuse, and very soon the entire basement would be blown to kingdom come. I needed to hurry, to get Alex out from the basement before it was too late. But despite my rush, the smoke had already started to pour into the hallway. It quickly set off the security system, causing a blaring alarm to echo through the darkness. Each and every door opened in response, allowing the subjects to escape. "Alex," I coughed out as I ran to his room. He was still sitting in the middle of the room, panicked by the sudden sound ringing through it. He looked pale as a sheet, as if something had drained the energy from his body. On the chairs surrounding him, I could barely make out vague shapes, resembling the twisted figures of the acolytes. They were draining Alex, using his body to cross over to our world. To Alex, they'd looked like children. I could see their facades. But as they got closer to our world, their true forms finally revealed themselves. Without hesitating, I ran over and snagged him away from the shadows, hoping to shield him from the horrific entities in the room. He hung limply in my arms, barely conscious enough to notice my presence. "Leave him alone," I yelled. My call snapped Alex back to reality, but he was still too weak to stand up on his own. I tried to carry him, but my legs collapsed under the pressure. It was only then I realized just how wounded I'd been by the flesh. "I saw you," Alex mumbled. "You saw me where?" "You were in the other place, with the children." I almost cried just from having him in my arms, but my concern outweighed the joy. "They weren't children, Alex, but it doesn't matter. We need to get out of here." I'd come so close to understanding the curse thrust upon myself and my mother, but Alex was something different. He had abilities I couldn't even begin to comprehend, and the acolytes were fully intent on using them to cross over worlds. "Mom, you're bleeding," Alex said as he lay in my arms. He was right. My entire back was soaked in blood from where the flesh had fused. I'd lost a good amount of it, but I couldn't tell whether or not it was still actively bleeding. "I'm fine, but we have to go, Alex," I ordered. I grabbed him and carried him into the hallway. We still had to get Riley's daughter to safety, and she was a couple of rooms further down. I groaned as I ran, feeling the skin on my back tear with each step. But as I got to Amanda's door, I realized it was still closed. "Amanda!" I screamed as I hammered on the door, but without my flashlight I couldn't see very far in. That's when I realized that the glass was covered in the flesh. It had grown across the door, preventing it from opening, and Amanda was still trapped inside. I banged on the door, desperately trying to open it as Alex hung around my neck, but it was a futile task. Even without him, I was too weak to help. She was gone, and I'd broken my promise to save her. Before I got a chance to come up with another plan, I heard the basement door slam open. The acolytes were coming into the basement, and there was no way we could get past them without weapons. Still, the thought of the inevitable explosion lingered in my mind. I knew it would only be a matter of minutes before the containers exploded, so I carried Alex back to his room and closed the door as we awaited the bang. Then, a brief but exceptionally loud bang rang through the room, before the entire building shook. The lights in Alex's room all shattered, causing shards of glass to rain down upon us. Simultaneously, the door broke off its hinges, and dust filled the air, making it impossible to get a proper breath of air. All the while, I held onto my son, just making sure the falling debris wouldn't hurt him. Once the room had finally stopped moving, I took the chance to open my eyes. Cracks had formed in the walls, from which dust poured out. I let out a few brutal coughs, clearing my lungs from dust. Alex was left pretty much unscathed, while I'd taken a few hits from various debris falling from the ceiling. The only source of light we had was small fires scattered around the basement. "We have to go, Alex," I coughed out. He was still too weak to walk alone, so I had to carry him in my arms as we entered the hallway. There, beneath the rubble, lay a few of the acolytes, blown to bits by the explosion. Their flesh still wriggled, trying to reform itself. It had bought us some time, but more of the monsters would soon approach. As we walked past the room that had exploded, I took a glance inside. The wall had been annihilated beyond repair, revealing a tunnel that led deeper into the ground. I quickly realized it was part of the interconnected sewer systems, and just might have been our only chance of escape. Still, the smell that hit me as I took even a single step inside almost made me turn around. It wasn't just the smell of sewage and shit, but something darker, more sinister. "I don't want to go in there," Alex cried. "I know, honey, but we don't have a choice." There were a few pieces of burning debris, some wood and chunks of charred flesh. Without a flashlight to guide the way, I had to improvise. I picked up a piece of wood, wrapped it in some cloth and some medical paraffin that had just about survived the explosion. It was enough to make a makeshift torch, similar to the ones I played around with as a kid, but it wouldn't last long. I shuddered at the thought of being blind in the sewers, but it beat the idea of being used by the acolytes. Alex had always been a small child, even for his age, so while carrying him around wasn't a tremendously difficult task, it did strain my wounds. He held his arms around my neck as I led the way with the torch. The light danced off the walls and reflected brightly in the murky waters full of piss. I tried my best not to inhale through my nose, but every now and then I'd get a whiff. What truly horrified me was the odd presence of rot, as if something had died down there, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I saw it, an almost fossilized corpse floating in the sewage, its meat stripped from the bones, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. The corpse had come from a pile of death lying just down the sewer. Dozens of corpses lay there in various stages of decomposition. They must have been the bodies the acolytes couldn't use, or the remnants of the parts they'd shredded. No burial, nor dignity, just a pile of death that served as a vague reminder of who the people had used to be. "Close your eyes, Alex." "Why?" "Just do it." His face was resting on my shoulder, but I still wanted to keep as many horrors away from his sensitive mind as possible. I slowly walked over to the pile, horrified that I actually had to step on the dead to cross. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I mumbled to myself. And then one of them moved. Their hand reached out for me. They were still alive. And that's when I realized that beneath the pile of people lay a mesh of acolyte flesh. It was forcefully keeping them alive, serving as a horrific life support system, similar to the one that had sent me to the other world. But the people within were still partially conscious, suffering within the flesh of the acolytes. I couldn't help them. They were too far gone, digested and broken down into an indistinguishable form. I lowered my torch, letting them ignite. I knew it would hurt them, but burning to death would be a preferable fate compared to the eternity they'd otherwise have to endure. As the fire spread across the suffering bodies, I turned to walk away. Those still conscious enough to feel the pain sobbed, letting out a few last gasps of air before finally getting their final rest. Then we walked, and the sewers were lit up by fire. There were a few inaccessible manholes above, letting the smoke escape without suffocating us, but we still moved fast to avoid the heat. The further we got away from the basement of Tenebra's care, the more Alex started to regain his strength. Before long he was able to walk by himself, albeit guided by my hand. I, on the other hand, kept getting weaker as blood flowed from my wounds. I had no means to patch myself up, which meant time would eventually run out if I didn't get any help. We walked through the maze of tunnels, desperately looking for a ladder to climb out. It'd be another mile before we finally found an exit, which was little more than a rusty ladder that might just crumble as we touched it. While Alex had regained a lot of his strength, he was in no condition to climb out. I let him cling onto my back as I started the ascent. Blood had been running down my arm from my shoulder, covering my hand in a slippery mess. I tried to wipe it on my shirt, but it barely removed any of it. I just held on for dear life, praying that I wouldn't slip and break my back. Once at the top, I pushed at the manhole cover, but it wouldn't budge. I kept banging at it, too weak to make the climb if I had to return back down. On the fifth and final push I had left in my body, it finally moved, loosening just enough to lift up. Daylight shone on my face for the first time in what felt like years, and I escaped with Alex still clinging to my back. I pushed us both out, letting Alex loose before I collapsed to the ground in exhaustion. As I lay there, I tried to look around at my surroundings, hoping to get bearings. As fate would have it, we were in my old neighborhood, just a few houses down from my childhood home. "Mom, get up," Alex begged, but I was too weak. I needed to rest. The street was situated on the outskirts of town, leading up to the only road out of it, but without a car, it would be a futile task to escape. The acolytes would surely find us before we could escape, and I knew then it had all been for naught. "Alex, you have to go," I said. "Go where?" "The road. You just have to follow it until you can find help." "What about you?" "I can't. I'm too weak." "No, Alex." My words were interrupted as I heard police sirens coming down the road. I turned my direction towards the sound to see a single patrol car coming into Tenebris from outside of town. They'd seen me lying on the ground and came rushing towards us. At first I couldn't believe it, but then it dawned on me that they must have been the officers Dawson had called before he died. 2 police officers jumped out of the car and came rushing to my aid. "Miss, are you all right?" one of them asked, before noticing just how much blood I was soaked in. "Oh God, we got to get her out of here," he said to the other. They bent down to check on me, making sure I was still conscious. "Miss, I'm Officer Roberts, and this is my partner, Officer Lawrence. We're going to get you out of here, all right?" I could barely speak out of shock. I just let them lift me up and carry me towards their car. On the way, I heard them talk to each other in a bit of confusion. "Hey, do you know where the nearest hospital is?" Roberts asked. "No, and I can't get a hold of anyone on the radio," Lawrence responded. They put the two of us in the car, and for the first time, I started to feel safe enough to relax. Things were getting dark around me, and I was just on the brink of losing consciousness. But then I heard the officers talk. Tenebra's Care seems to be the closest facility. They might have medical supplies while we wait to get proper help, Lawrence suggested. No, I called out, too weak for them to hear. Alex tried to get their attention, but the officers seemed too scared to listen. Don't take us there. We need to leave, I said again, just loud enough for Roberts to hear me. What was that? He asked. It's dangerous. We need to get out of town, please. What's dangerous? The acolytes. Please, don't take us back. He looked concerned, but equally confused. Miss, you're in shock. We need to get you some help, Robert said. Hey, there's someone there, Lawrence shouted. Hey, sir, could you help us for a moment? I peeked out the window to see one of the humanoid acolytes come close. They'd already found us. Stay away from him, I called out weakly. He's not human. What? But it was too late. The acolyte had reached Lawrence. Without further hesitation, it reached out its arm, punching it through Lawrence's abdomen, instantly crushing his internal organs. With that, he started to shed his flesh, revealing his true form as Lawrence's guts fell onto the ground below. Roberts was in shock, but trained enough to act fast. He pulled his weapon and aimed it at the transforming acolyte. Stop right there. But the acolyte didn't listen. It just slowly approached Roberts, almost as if enjoying the suffering it was about to cause. To them, this wasn't much more than a game, one they thought for sure they could win. Run! We have to get out of here, I called from the car, but Roberts wouldn't listen. He was too concerned with his rapidly dying partner, not realizing he stood no chance. He fired a few rounds at the acolyte, but it hardly slowed down. What the hell are you? He stuttered. As the acolyte reached out to kill Roberts, I knew there was nothing I could do for them. So with a final bit of my energy, I crawled from the back seat into the driver's seat. The keys were still in the ignition, and with Roberts screaming in agony, I started to drive away. I swerved down the road, desperately trying to get away, and while the acolytes were fast, there was no way they could catch up with a speeding car. We drove onto Glover Road, ready to finally leave Tenebris for good. Still, there was no way I could make the several-hour-long trip to the next town over. I needed to call for help, but how far I had to drive before I could finally get a signal, I didn't know. The car came equipped with a radio, which meant we could reach someone even without a phone. As we got an hour out of town, the radio finally scurried to life, producing indistinct chatter. Without hesitating, I grabbed it, ready to transmit my own call for help. Hello, is there anyone there? Please, we need help. Who is this? How did you get on this line? My name is Laura Florence. I'm injured and I'm on Glover Road, 50 miles outside of Tenebris. Please, we need help. We're on our way. Please stay on the... But with that, the connection died. I was starting to lose control of the car, so I just had to stop. It no longer mattered. They had heard the distress call. We're going to be all right, Alex. They're coming to save us, were the last words I said as the world around me went dark. As I sat unconscious in the car, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. All the pain and misery I'd felt only moments earlier had vanished. In a way, it was as if I'd died. I just existed in the endless void, feeling nothing but bliss. The acolytes, the injuries, the dangers, nothing mattered. A dim light appeared in the distance, and time merged together as a single moment where everything happened all at once. Then I felt a jolt, and I suddenly awoke once more. Mrs. Florence, are you there? A voice softly called out. I opened my eyes and realized I was lying in a comfortable hospital bed. Everything around me seemed so clean, so calm. I'd been saved. We thought we'd lost you for a second, but you're a fighter. It was a doctor standing before me, holding onto a chart. Where am I? Mercy Hospital. You got airlifted here for surgery. You suffered from shock and a punctured lung. It's a miracle you got as far as you did. Just the fact that I was out of tenebris was victory enough. The surgery, the pain I was in, none of it mattered because we'd managed to escape. "Can I see my son?" I asked. The doctor looked confused. Yeah, do you have a number we can call or something? Does he live around here?" "No, he was with me. He's just a boy. Where is he?" I asked, getting nervous. "Miss, you were alone when we found you. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's no way anyone could have walked away from that." No, he was with me. He came with me to Tenebris, but I saved him. Please, tell me you found him," I said, rambling in shock. The doctor looked at me with pity in his eyes. He thought I was crazy, but if Alex hadn't been found with me, it meant that he was still trapped in Tenebris. And so once again, we reach the end of tonight's podcast. My thanks as always to the authors of those wonderful stories, and to you for taking the time to listen. Now, I'd ask one small favor of you. Wherever you get your podcast from, please write a few nice words and leave a 5-star review, as it really helps the podcast. That's it for this week, but I'll be back again same time, same place, and I do so hope you'll join me once more. Until next time, sweet dreams and bye-bye.